The first time Rick noticed the light, it wasn't the kind you see spilling through a window or dancing across the walls. It was quieter, softer, like a memory brushing against the edges of his mind before he even knew it was there. It hovered in the corner of his room, shifting in hues he couldn't name, almost humming with a sound that existed somewhere between a sigh and a lullaby. He blinked, and it was gone, leaving behind a lingering warmth on his cheek, a quiet promise that something unseen was waiting. "We truly love and care for you," he thought, even as a small part of him knew that love was not always loud, not always spoken. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. Rick had always been one to notice the little things that others overlooked. A pattern in the wallpaper, a shadow that lingered too long, the way the wind seemed to carry voices no one else could hear. Sometimes he felt the world was quietly speaking to him, telling him its soft, hidden truths if he only knew how to listen. And at 7 years old, he was listening more than he was talking, scribbling little notes in a tattered notebook he carried everywhere, jotting down fleeting thoughts about the lights, the whispers, the small mysteries that seemed to follow him like invisible companions. On one particular evening, he had stayed up later than usual, pressed against the window pane, watching the stars tremble in a sky so deep it seemed to hum beneath his fingertips. There was a comet that night, a thin streak of silver that arched across the heavens, and he swore it lingered, waiting for him to notice, lingering longer than it should. His small heart pulsed with awe, and he whispered to it, as if it were a friend, "I see you." And somehow the light in the corner of his room flickered back, answering him in a language only they understood. He didn't always understand the world, and sometimes it frightened him, how quiet it could be, how much it held beyond sight. But there was a comfort in knowing that he was part of its soft rhythm, that his own small presence mattered in ways he could not yet measure. That night, he drew the light in his notebook, a tangled swirl of lines and colors, impossible to name, but somehow alive on the page. And as he traced its shape, his mother's voice floated up the staircase, calling him to bed. He left the drawing unfinished, but not forgotten. Even the simplest things carried weight for Rick. A misplaced sock, a half-fallen leaf on the path. Outside, a neighbor's gentle smile. They were fragments of a bigger puzzle, pieces of a world that was quietly extraordinary if you looked close enough. And often, when he felt a flicker of fear or loneliness, he would wrap himself in the rhythm of noticing, letting the small details guide him back to calm. A flicker of movement outside, the soft creak of the floorboards, the brush of night air on his skin. All of it became part of a gentle map of understanding, a way to feel connected even when words fell short. By the time he drifted off to sleep, his mind was a quiet tangle of glowing threads, the lights, the stars, the whispers that slipped through cracks in the walls. Dreams came slowly, not as sharp images but as soft impressions, like memories of things that had never happened, places he might one day visit, people he might one day know. And somewhere in the softness of those early dreams, he began to feel something deep and unshakable, a sense that he could belong to something greater than himself, that the mysteries he chased might not be frightening at all, but part of a gentle, unfolding story that was patiently waiting for him. The night passed without incident, yet, in that quietness, something important had already begun. A tiny spark of understanding, a glimmer of curiosity wrapped in calm, had taken root inside him. It was not the excitement of adventure, nor the thrill of danger, but the quiet knowing that he was part of a story far larger than he could yet see. And as the first hints of dawn brushed the edges of his window, Rick's small chest rose and fell in time with a soft, invisible rhythm, a pulse shared with the lights, the stars, and the gentle world around him. And in that moment, even if he didn't know it yet, the beginning of a journey had already whispered itself into place, a journey of quiet wonders, gentle discoveries, and the soft, patient magic of noticing. The mornings after those first quiet nights felt different to Rick, though he couldn't have named why. The light that had visited him seemed to linger in the corners of his vision, soft and patient, like a presence that simply waited for him to notice. Breakfast was a gentle ritual of warmth and familiarity, the faint scent of toast, the slow murmur of conversation in the kitchen, but his mind was already drifting toward the edges of the day, toward the small mysteries that seemed to bloom in ordinary places. Even the sunlight spilling in through the window felt attentive, as though it had paused to brush lightly across the tabletop just for him. He began to notice more, the way the dust motes danced in the air like tiny, weightless travelers, the faint echo of a neighbor humming a tune across the street, the ripple of leaves on the branch outside his window when the wind brushed past. Each moment carried a subtle weight, a soft imprint of life's quiet motion, and Rick discovered that he could trace those movements and, in doing so, trace his own sense of belonging within them. He started to carry a small journal with him everywhere, filling it with tiny observations, lines of thought, and sketches that made no immediate sense, but felt important nonetheless. It became a map of the invisible threads connecting him to the world. One afternoon, while tracing a particularly elegant pattern in the clouds above the old playground near his house, he heard a voice that startled him more than it should have. "You see things differently," it said, soft and unassuming, as if speaking through the breeze itself. Rick turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the playground was empty, the swings still swaying gently in the wind, and the voice didn't belong to anyone. It belonged to the world itself, or at least that's how it felt. He pressed a finger to the page of his journal and wrote, "Some things speak even when no one is there." It was in moments like these that Rick began to understand something about patience, about the delicate art of listening to what wasn't obvious. His curiosity was no longer a burst of energy that demanded answers, but a quiet pulse guiding him to look closer, to lean in toward the subtle rhythms others overlooked. And with that patience came a sense of empathy, the realization that even the smallest gestures, a nod, a shared glance, a quietly offered toy, carried weight far beyond their apparent simplicity. At home, his parents noticed the change too, though they rarely commented directly. They saw him linger by the window, eyes tracing the movement of birds in a slow, deliberate rhythm. They saw him offering the shyest smiles to people he passed, or pausing mid-step to bend down and examine an insect crawling along the pavement. It was the kind of attention that most would dismiss, yet for Rick, it was part of a larger understanding of the world, a soft communion with life's unnoticed beauty. By the time evening arrived, he would sometimes return to his room and sit beneath the dim glow of his small lamp, opening his journal once more. The light in the corner that had first visited him earlier had not returned in the same way, but its absence was not emptiness. It was a quiet encouragement, a soft challenge for him to continue noticing, continue reflecting. He sketched clouds, scribbled lines, traced patterns in the floorboards, and always, somewhere in the background of his mind, he felt the pulse of that other presence, patient and unobtrusive, reminding him that the world's secrets were not prizes to be seized, but melodies to be felt. Some nights, as sleep finally pulled him into its gentle embrace, Rick would find himself imagining the possibilities of what lay beyond the familiar. Streets and soft hum of the neighborhood. He imagined quiet forests where trees whispered in languages only partly known, rivers that hummed with memories, and skies so wide they could hold every question he had ever asked. The feeling was not one of fear, but of tender curiosity, like leaning over the edge of a dream and realizing the world below was waiting patiently, unhurried, ready to reveal itself only when he was prepared to see. And in those pre-dawn hours, as the neighborhood slept and the sky slowly lightened, Rick realized something that would become central to him in the years ahead, that life, in its quiet moments, carried a gentle kind of magic. Not the loud, dramatic kind that demanded attention, but the kind that lingered in glances, in light, in the spaces between breaths. A magic that required patience, that blossomed only for those willing to notice. And though he could not yet name it, he understood, with a soft certainty, that this quiet magic, this attention to the unseen and the small, would follow him through everything, shaping the way he moved, the way he felt, and the way he would one day touch the lives of others. The first time Rick truly felt the weight of another heart moving alongside his own, it was not in a loud or spectacular way. It came quietly, through the soft persistence of a presence that seemed to echo some part of himself he had only glimpsed in fleeting moments. He had wandered one morning to the far edge of the playground, where the grass was still damp with dew and the air carried the faint scent of earth and moss. There he met a boy named Elliot, whose eyes held the same patient curiosity that Rick had been nurturing for months. There were no grand introductions, no shouted greetings, just a shared pause, two children noticing the small movements of the world around them and, in that noticing, recognizing one another. They began to spend hours together, not in frantic games or loud declarations, but in quiet companionship. Rick discovered that Elliot had a habit of tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick, mapping the invisible rhythms of life in ways Rick could almost understand. Elliot spoke little, but his presence was steady, and that steadiness was a comfort Rick had never known. They watched clouds drift, counted the shadows stretching across the playground, and sometimes, without speaking, simply sat on the swings, feeling the gentle sway of wind and time. Rick's heart began to expand in ways that were almost imperceptible, and understanding that someone else could see the same small wonders he had always clung to, and that these moments mattered more when shared. One afternoon, as they rested beneath the branches of a low-hanging tree, Rick noticed a soft shimmer at the edge of the garden, where the light filtered through the leaves in scattered, dancing patterns. He pointed it out to Elliot, and, for the first time, a small smile spread across the other boy's face, quiet, almost hidden, but luminous in its sincerity. "It's like it's alive," Elliot said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Rick nodded, feeling the same sense of wonder ripple through him, and in that shared recognition a bond was sealed. It was a quiet, invisible thread that tied them together, a gentle understanding that the world held mysteries worth noticing, and that they could notice them together. Rick began to see the power in these small connections, the way simple attentiveness could bloom into trust, the way quiet companionship could nurture courage. He realized that even when Elliot did not speak, he was teaching him something profound, that patience and empathy were themselves forms of heroism, small acts of bravery that did not demand applause but shaped the soul. In Elliot's company, Rick discovered the gentle art of listening, not just to the world around him, but to the subtle currents of another person's heart. The days stretched on in this rhythm, each one a soft unfolding of ordinary magic. They traced the edges of their small neighborhood together, discovering corners of the world that seemed almost invisible, patterns that had been there all along but unnoticed. Rick would sketch what he saw, and Elliot would add the smallest details: a swirl of leaves, the curve of a puddle, the faint glimmer of dew catching the sunlight. Their notebooks began to mirror one another, not exactly alike, but connected in a way that made each of them feel seen, understood, and not entirely alone. At home, Rick would replay the days quietly in his mind, his journal now heavier with new observations, new lines of thought, and a soft gratitude for the presence of someone who understood him without explanation. Even the light that had once visited him in his room seemed to acknowledge this new bond, flickering faintly at the edges of his vision, as if approving of this gentle companionship. Rick could feel the pulse of connection threading through his life, a warmth that settled deep inside, reminding him that the world's mysteries were sweeter when shared. Evenings became a time for reflection. Rick would lie beneath the ceiling of his room, the faint shimmer of stars peeking through the curtains, and replay the day's quiet moments in his mind. He thought of Elliot's small gestures, the way a shared smile could illuminate a whole afternoon, the way silence could be as meaningful as words. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Rick began to understand something that would shape the rest of his life. That the most profound discoveries were not always found in explosions or inventions, but in soft attentiveness, in the patient noticing of life and of hearts, and in the quiet courage to connect. And as sleep approached, carrying him into the realm of dreams, Rick felt a gentle assurance settle over him. It was not a grand promise, not a map to some great adventure, but a quiet truth that would follow him forever. That even in a world of mysteries, even in moments of solitude, there was always room for connection, always room for wonder, and always room for the soft, unwavering presence of another heart beside his own. The days grew longer as the sun leaned over the rooftops, casting thin gold threads across the streets and alleys that Rick and Elliot explored together. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of their footsteps. Rick found that his curiosity, once a quiet pulse at the edges of his mind, now had a companion to amplify it, and that amplification was gentle rather than urgent. Each turn of a corner, each tilt of a branch, seemed to carry the promise of something unnoticed, something waiting patiently to be discovered. The world did not rush, and neither did they. One afternoon, they wandered toward the abandoned lot at the edge of town, where wildflowers grew in hesitant clusters, and the wind carried the faint scent of old memories. Rick noticed patterns in the way the sunlight pooled among the flowers, and he crouched to trace the shapes with a stick, mapping the invisible pathways of shadows and light. Elliot crouched beside him, his small fingers brushing against the earth, tracing trails Rick had never noticed. "It's like it's speaking," Elliot whispered, his eyes wide. Rick nodded, feeling the same hum of quiet magic in the soil and air. There was no need for words beyond that. The earth, the sunlight, the tiny movements of life between the cracks of concrete spoke volumes in a language only patient eyes could hear. It was in this abandoned lot that Rick began to experiment with the small powers that life seemed to offer him, the kind that were never loud or flashy but subtle and persistent. He discovered he could coax tiny sprouts from seeds buried in the dirt, not through force or technique, but simply by noticing, by attending to them with care. The plants grew as if grateful for his gentle attention, and he felt a soft thrill, not pride exactly, but a deep, reflective satisfaction that came from witnessing life respond to quiet care. Elliot watched him work, his eyes reflecting the same awe, and together they marveled at the slow unfolding of growth, the patient rhythm of the world responding to presence rather than demand. Even as Rick explored these small wonders, he began to notice patterns beyond the plants, in the play of shadows along walls, in the soft ripple of clouds across the sky, in the way birds paused mid-flight as if listening. He started to realize that life was full of these subtle correspondences, tiny echoes that connected one thing to another, if one only paid attention. And in that realization he found a kind of quiet joy, a satisfaction that did not shout but lingered in the chest, like the hum of a distant bell. At home, the journal in his room grew heavier, now filled with sketches of plants, clouds, light patterns, and the occasional fleeting glimpse of shapes he could not name. He drew the lot with its flowers and its silent corners, and he drew himself, and Elliot, noting the invisible threads that tied their days together. The act of recording these moments became a meditation, a way to honor the world he was learning to inhabit, and each stroke of his pencil was a soft dialogue with the life he observed. Evenings, when the light faded and the stars began to pierce the sky, Rick would stand at his window and trace the constellations with his finger, imagining the invisible lines that connected one star to another, just as he felt lines connecting himself to the earth, to Elliot, and to the quiet pulse of existence itself. The soft light in the corner of his room, which had been absent for some days, flickered faintly, a gentle reminder that even in stillness there was attention, even in silence there was communication, and even in ordinary spaces there was magic waiting to be noticed. It was in these days, moving through ordinary streets and abandoned lots, tracing shadows and coaxing growth from the earth, that Rick began to understand the rhythm of discovery. Curiosity was not always a rush toward answers. It was the patient act of noticing, the gentle discipline of paying attention to what was often overlooked. And he began to see that the small acts of care, the moments of quiet observation, were as profound as any grand adventure he had imagined in his dreams. As he drifted to sleep beneath the first pale light of morning, Rick carried a soft, unspoken gratitude for the day, for the light in the lot, for the patterns in shadows, for Elliot's quiet companionship, and for the gentle guidance of a world that seemed to reward attentiveness and patience. And somewhere, beyond the walls of his room, the faint shimmer of unseen presences lingered, as if acknowledging that he was learning, gently but surely, the language of the quiet, unfolding world. The weeks that followed were a quiet unfolding, a gentle layering of days that felt as though the world itself had slowed its heartbeat to match Rick's own. The abandoned lot became their sanctuary, a place where ordinary details carried the weight of wonder and discovery. Rick began to notice the subtle signs of change, the way a single blade of grass bent differently depending on the morning sun, the soft, almost imperceptible trembling of leaves when a bird passed overhead, the faint scent of rain lingering in the soil long after the clouds had moved on. Elliot, ever patient and attentive, mirrored his fascination, and together they lingered in these observations as if they were the most important lessons the universe had to offer. One afternoon, the wind carried a different sound, softer than usual, something almost like a whisper brushing against the edge of perception. Rick paused mid-step, tilting his head to catch the faint rhythm, and for the first time he felt a subtle alignment between what he was noticing and something far beyond the ordinary world. Elliot, noticing the change in Rick's posture, stepped closer and whispered, "Do you hear it too?" Rick nodded, unable to speak immediately, because the sound was not words, but feeling, a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the ground, through the air, and even through his own chest. They stood together silent, absorbing the presence that was neither threatening nor loud, merely existing, patient, and waiting for recognition. That evening, Rick returned home with a sense of calm wonder vibrating in his limbs. He traced the patterns of light in his room, imagining the invisible currents that had carried the wind's whisper into his awareness. He opened his journal and began sketching, not just the shapes he could see, but the sensations he could feel, the trembling of leaves, the hum of air over the grass, the tiny shiver of life that accompanied these quiet messages. Drawing became more than recording. It became an act of translating the world's soft language into something he could understand, something he could touch with thought and imagination. At times, the small light that had first appeared months ago flickered faintly in the corner of his room. It did not speak or move in any deliberate way, but Rick felt its presence as a gentle encouragement, an acknowledgement of the attention he was giving to life's subtleties. He began to sense that these quiet forces were not merely phenomena to be observed, but teachers guiding him toward an understanding that went deeper than mere curiosity. In the soft silence, he realized that he was learning patience, empathy, and the rare ability to listen without demanding response. Rick and Elliot's afternoons began to take on the rhythm of quiet experiments, not in the sense of explosions or inventions, but in subtle tests of awareness. They would drop leaves into puddles to see how the ripples spread, watch insects navigate blades of grass, or track the way shadows lengthened and shortened as the day progressed. Nothing they did had immediate consequence or dramatic revelation, yet everything seemed to ripple softly outward, leaving impressions that neither boy could fully measure. It was a world of cause and effect expressed in whispers rather than shouts, and Rick felt deeply attuned to its pulse. At home, he sometimes caught himself smiling at small, almost invisible details, the way the lamplight pooled on the floorboards, the faint creak of a door hinge, or the way dust shimmered in a single beam of sunlight. His parents noticed his quiet contentment and the new attentiveness in his eyes, though they rarely asked questions. They had learned, without needing words, that Rick was following some invisible path, guided by something beyond their immediate comprehension. And Rick, in turn, understood that this path was his own, a journey into patience, observation, and the small heroism of noticing what others often overlooked. As dusk approached, Rick would lie on his bed, the journal resting against his chest, and reflect on the day's discoveries. The wind still whispered outside, the patterns of light shifted as the stars peeked through the curtains, and he felt a gentle pulse of gratitude for the quiet, for Elliot's companionship, and for the subtle guidance of a world that seemed to respond when he simply paid attention. The hum of presence, faint and patient, lingered at the edges of his awareness, a soft reminder that there were always more mysteries to notice, more connections to honor, and more moments of stillness to treasure. And as sleep drew him toward the realm of dreams, Rick felt the quiet thrill of belonging, not to a grand adventure, but to the slow, patient rhythm of life itself. He understood that even the smallest gestures, the most fleeting observations, could leave ripples in the world, invisible but enduring. And somewhere, perhaps beyond sight or hearing, the soft light of attention, patience, and wonder continued to hum along with him, guiding him gently into the next day's quiet discoveries. As the days stretched into early summer, Rick began to notice that the world seemed to respond more subtly to his presence than it had before. It was never sudden or dramatic, never a flash or a roar, but a quiet responsiveness, as if the universe itself acknowledged his gentle attentiveness. He discovered that if he lingered near the wildflowers in the abandoned lot, bending low to examine a single bloom, the petals seemed to lean toward him, almost imperceptibly, as though seeking his recognition. The soil beneath his fingers carried warmth and rhythm, responding to the pressure of his touch with a soft, living pulse. Elliot noticed it too, watching the smallest stems curve in ways that seemed deliberate, almost as if the plants themselves understood the care being offered. Rick began to experiment with this awareness in tiny ways. He would hover a hand above the puddles after a rainstorm, noticing how the surface rippled, how small insects danced across it, and how the reflection of the clouds seemed to bend toward his observation. Nothing he did forced a change, yet he sensed a connection forming, a quiet correspondence between his intentions and the responses of the world. It was as if the universe was teaching him the patient art of influence, not through power or strength, but through attention, tenderness, and gentle persistence. One afternoon, while sketching the patterns of shadows cast by a tall oak in the lot, Rick felt a subtle tingle in his fingers. He had felt something like it before, a faint awareness that the world's small movements were echoing within him, but now it seemed sharper, more insistent. He traced the shadow of a branch with his pencil, and the swaying of the leaves mirrored his movements as if in conversation. Elliot, kneeling beside him, tilted his head, eyes wide, whispering, "It's like you're talking without words." Rick nodded, his chest warm with the soft thrill of discovery. For the first time, he began to understand that his attentiveness could shape the world around him in the smallest but meaningful ways, a quiet power rooted in care rather than force. Even at home, Rick began to sense subtle changes. The small light that occasionally flickered in his room seemed to respond to his moods, dimming when he was restless, brightening when he lingered in quiet observation. He could almost hear its faint hum when he pressed his hand against the desk, a sound that wasn't exactly sound but vibration, a resonance that seemed to mirror the rhythm of his heartbeat. It was both astonishing and soothing, a reminder that there were layers of existence he was only beginning to understand, soft whispers of connection hidden within ordinary moments. Rick shared these discoveries with Elliot in hushed, reverent tones, and together they began to test the boundaries of attention and care. They would arrange pebbles in patterns, noticing how ants or wind shifted them over time, and then reset them, observing the quiet dialogue that emerged between deliberate action and the world's natural tendencies. Each experiment reinforced a truth Rick had begun to feel deeply. Influence was not about control, but about harmonizing with life's gentle rhythms, participating rather than commanding, noticing rather than changing. Evenings became an extension of these small lessons. Rick would lie in bed, journal open, sketching not only what he saw but what he felt, the subtle tingle in his fingertips, the quiet acknowledgement of the plants, the faint resonance of unseen forces that seemed to hum in unison with his curiosity. He wrote notes to himself about patience, empathy, and the extraordinary value of small attentions. These reflections were neither formal nor grandiose, merely quiet inscriptions of the soul, shaping his understanding of his own emerging abilities. By nightfall, Rick often found himself gazing at the stars through his window, imagining, invisible, threads connecting the plants, the puddles, the light in his room, and even Elliot's quiet presence beside him. The soft shimmer of the unseen light flickered faintly at the edges of his awareness, as if approving this newfound harmony. And as sleep approached, carrying him gently toward dreams, Rick felt a deep, unspoken understanding that the smallest, powers, those of attention, empathy, and care, were often the most profound, capable of shaping a world without noise or spectacle. In the stillness of night, beneath the soft blanket of stars, Rick's chest rose and fell in rhythm with the quiet pulse of life around him. He was learning that influence need not be grand to be real, that heroism could exist in attentiveness, and that even the faintest resonance between a heart and the world could carry meaning beyond measure. And somewhere, in the gentle spaces of twilight and memory, he felt certain that these soft discoveries were only the beginning, guiding him toward deeper understanding, quiet courage, and the patient shaping of a life that, though gentle, could touch the lives of others in ways both visible and unseen. The next morning carried a quiet weight, not of expectation, but of possibility. Rick awoke with the gentle awareness that the small abilities he had begun to notice, the subtle influence of attention, the faint resonance of life responding to care, were not merely curiosities, but threads connecting him to the world and, more importantly, to the people around him. As he dressed slowly, the soft light spilling through the window seemed to linger longer than usual, brushing the edges of his desk and floor as if acknowledging that he had learned something new. The day itself felt slower, more deliberate, as though the universe had paused to allow him to step fully into this soft rhythm of noticing and participating. He met Elliot at the abandoned lot, where the grass swayed with the gentlest breeze, and the wildflowers trembled faintly under the weight of sunlight. Without a word, they began to explore, tracing patterns in the earth, watching shadows drift, and attending to the tiniest movements of life. Rick's awareness had grown, and he realized that his quiet influence extended beyond plants and puddles. It extended to Elliot as well. The boy seemed lighter, calmer, more attuned to the patterns of their surroundings whenever Rick lingered nearby. There was no need for magic or words, just presence. And in that subtle companionship, Rick felt the profound warmth of shared awareness, a sense that two hearts, quietly attuned, could ripple across the world without raising a sound. As they moved through the lot, Rick noticed a small sapling, bent under the weight of the morning dew. He rested a hand lightly against it, feeling the soft shiver that ran along its stem and guided it upright without forcing. Elliot knelt beside him, eyes wide, whispering, "It's like you can talk to it." Rick shook his head softly, smiling. "Not talking," he said. "Listening." And in that word the days seemed to shift. The air held a quieter resonance, the light softened, and even the smallest insects paused in their work to hover for a moment longer than usual. Listening, he realized, was more powerful than speaking. Attention could coax life into gentle alignment without demand, and the act itself carried a grace he had never understood until now. They spent hours in this quiet communion, tracing patterns, in leaves, arranging small stones along the edges of puddles, and observing the ripples that followed every tiny intervention. Rick began to sense the emotional consequence of his attention as well. Elliot, who had once been quietly curious, now mirrored the patience and attentiveness Rick practiced. The boys' smiles were softer, more frequent, and filled with an awareness of their shared presence. It was the first time Rick understood that influence was not just about the physical world. It extended to hearts, subtly shaping understanding, trust, and comfort. Even as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Rick felt a deep satisfaction, tempered with humility. His powers were not grand or dramatic. They were soft, patient, almost invisible, yet profoundly real. He saw how small actions, A touch, a gesture, a shared glance could ripple outward, shaping the day, the environment, and the emotional landscape of those around him. And in this realization, he found both joy and responsibility. The quiet care he offered to the world mattered in ways seen and unseen, and it had to be measured with empathy and patience. That evening, at home, Rick reflected on the day while sketching in his journal. The sapling, the stones, the shifting shadows all became symbols, reminders of the subtle ways he could touch life. He wrote down observations, careful not to overthink or overanalyze, but to capture the rhythm of the day. How listening and attending could guide growth, how gentle influence could nurture trust, and how quiet attention could reveal beauty and connection that might otherwise be overlooked. The small light in the corner of his room flickered faintly, acknowledging his reflections with a soft shimmer. As he lay beneath the ceiling, the stars peeking through the curtains, Rick thought about the invisible threads that tied him to Elliot, to the plants, and to the world around him. He understood now that even the quietest gestures mattered, that his presence could shape both life and emotion without a single word being spoken. And as sleep began to pull him into its embrace, he felt a tender certainty settle in his chest, that the subtle powers he was learning were not tools of force or control, but instruments of empathy, patience, and quiet heroism, capable of touching the lives of others in ways that would echo far beyond the day. And somewhere in the hush of night, the faint hum of unseen presences lingered at the edges of awareness, as if affirming that Rick's journey, though gentle, quiet, and almost imperceptible, was unfolding exactly as it should, shaping a world that was listening, responding, and quietly alive alongside him. The days began to stretch differently for Rick after that summer's gentle hum, the rhythm of attention and care, the subtle influence he had discovered in plants, shadows, and even in Elliot's presence had become almost second nature. Yet, as quietly as the world had revealed its soft language to him, it also began to show him its boundaries. One morning, the abandoned lot felt heavier, the light less playful, the air carrying a slight tension he couldn't immediately place. A fallen branch blocked the path they usually took, a small obstruction that in ordinary circumstances would have been nothing. But Rick felt a ripple in the quiet thread he had come to trust, an awareness that even gentle influence had limits, and that the world sometimes resisted, even in its tiniest gestures. Elliot noticed it first. He had stooped to examine a patch of moss when Rick lingered by the sapling, trying to coax it upright. The moss remained stubbornly flattened, ignoring the careful attention Rick offered. "It's not listening," Elliot said softly, almost in a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might break the fragile rhythm of the morning. Rick knelt beside him, fingers hovering over the tiny plants, feeling the subtle resistance in the soil, the faint recoil of life that did not respond. For the first time, he felt a quiet frustration, not anger exactly, but a soft dissonance that unsettled him. Rick realized then that his abilities, subtle though they were, did not command compliance. They required patience, respect, and attentiveness to the world's own rhythms. Some things could not be persuaded, coaxed, or nudged. They existed according to rules he had yet to understand. It was a lesson that carried an emotional weight heavier than any he had encountered, and yet it was delivered in the same soft voice the world had always used, through gentle resistance rather than confrontation. Elliot, sensing Rick's uncertainty, rested a small hand on his shoulder. "Maybe it's not about making it move," he said. "Maybe it's just about noticing it." The words settled over Rick like a cool breeze, easing the tension in his chest. He withdrew his fingers, letting the sapling lean as it would, letting the moss remain flattened. And as he did, he noticed something remarkable. Even without intervention, the world continued to carry life forward in its own subtle ways. A leaf shifted in the wind, a single petal lifted, a bird trilled somewhere above. It was a quiet reminder that his role was not to dominate, but to observe, to harmonize, to participate with patience rather than demand. Later, as they walked home, Rick carried a soft awareness of the day's lesson. The obstacles, the resistance, the unresponsive moments, they were all part of the larger pattern he had begun to understand. Empathy, he realized, was not about changing everything to suit one's intentions. It was about feeling alongside, noticing the currents of life and emotion, and moving with them rather than against them. Even in frustration, there was growth, and even in small failures, there was a deep understanding waiting to be absorbed. At home, he opened his journal and sketched the lot as it had been that morning, the fallen branch, the stubborn moss, and the swaying sapling. He added notes in soft pencil, reflecting on the limits he had encountered, on the necessity of patience, and on the gentle art of letting go. Even the flickering light in the corner of his room seemed to linger longer that evening, as if acknowledging the quiet strength required to accept that not everything could be shaped by intention alone. Rick lay in bed that night, thinking about the day, the resistance, and the small victories hidden in the smallest moments. He realized that growth was not always visible, that influence was not always immediate, and that patience was itself a form of power, quiet yet profound. And as sleep drew him into its gentle embrace, he felt a soft, steady pulse of understanding, settled deep inside that even when things did not move as he wished, even when the world resisted, there was beauty in noticing, grace in patience, and quiet heroism in the effort to remain attentive and empathetic. Somewhere in the hush of night, the faint hum of unseen presences lingered at the edges of perception, as if affirming that Rick's journey, though filled with subtle challenges and quiet lessons, was unfolding with the same deliberate patience that he had begun to practice, guiding him gently toward a deeper understanding of connection, empathy, and the quiet courage to honor the world as it was. The following mornings carried a different kind of quiet promise. Rick had begun to notice that the world did not just respond to his attention in isolated moments, but that his own presence seemed to ripple outward in ways he could only sense subtly. He was learning that influence was never loud or dramatic. It was soft, almost invisible, and yet profoundly tangible to those who were sensitive enough to feel it. Walking to the abandoned lot with Elliot, he noticed a neighbor tending her small garden across the street. As he lingered near the gate, observing the way she moved among the plants, he realized her steps had grown slower, more deliberate, almost mirroring his own patient rhythm. It was not intentional, not conscious, but he felt the faintest echo of his presence shaping the tempo of her morning. Elliot noticed it too. "She seems calmer," he whispered, leaning closer to Rick. "Like she's breathing differently." Rick nodded, a soft thrill stirring in his chest. He had never thought of influence in this way, not as domination, not as command, but as a gentle resonance that could touch others without a word being spoken. And in that realization, he felt a deepened responsibility, a quiet awareness that his attentiveness carried not just discovery, but consequence. In the lot, they practiced small experiments, not of control, but of observation. A fallen leaf was nudged by Rick's fingers, and they watched together as it settled differently, caught in a swirl of wind he hadn't expected. The ripple of effect, imperceptible to anyone else, carried weight to Rick and Elliot, a subtle lesson that even the smallest interactions could produce changes that mattered in ways invisible but real. They traced these effects across stones, puddles and blades of grass, imagining the quiet web of connection that linked all living things, noticing the hum of life that responded to careful attention. Rick began to understand the emotional consequences of his presence in ways more profound than plants or patterns. One afternoon, as they returned home from the lot, they found a young boy sitting alone on the curb, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the cracked pavement. Elliot approached cautiously, offering a small smile, while Rick lingered slightly behind, observing not just the boy, but the spaces around him, the light that brushed his hair, the faint tremor of a leaf nearby. Slowly, the boy looked up, and his gaze met Rick's, hesitant, searching, yet perceptive. Rick offered a soft nod, and in that instant he felt the fragile connection of attention, recognition, and empathy. The boy's posture shifted, subtly but undeniably, as if the quiet acknowledgement of another presence had granted him a measure of ease. The moment lingered in Rick's mind long after they walked away. Influence, he realized, was not about manipulation, nor was it about achieving immediate results. It was about noticing, respecting, and responding with care. He began to see that the quiet gestures, the nod, the glance, the patient attention could ripple through lives in ways he could not always measure, shaping moods, comfort, and trust without ceremony or expectation. It was a gentle, invisible form of heroism, one that demanded patience, awareness, and humility. That evening, as Rick wrote in his journal, he reflected on the day's subtle lessons. He drew the lot, the leaves, the puddles, and the young boy, on the curb, annotating each with notes on attention, resonance, and the unseen consequences of presence. The flickering light in the corner of his room seemed to linger longer that night, casting soft, approving glimmers across the pages. He understood that influence carried weight even when imperceptible, and that empathy, patience, and quiet attentiveness were themselves powers capable of touching lives in the smallest, most profound ways. As he lay beneath the soft canopy of his ceiling, the stars peeking through the curtains, Rick felt a deep, steady pulse of gratitude. Gratitude for Elliot's companionship, for the tender responses of the world, and for the invisible threads connecting hearts and lives beyond immediate awareness. He realized that his journey was becoming less about discovery alone and more about presence, patience, and the ripples of care that extended beyond himself. And as sleep drew him into its embrace, he carried with him the quiet thrill of knowing that even the smallest attentions, those invisible yet enduring, could shape life, emotion, and understanding in ways that were tender, profound, and infinitely lasting. Somewhere in the hush of night, the faint hum of the world lingered at the edges of perception, soft and patient, as if affirming that Rick's quiet heroism, grounded in empathy and observation, was unfolding exactly as it should, guiding him toward deeper connection, understanding, and the subtle shaping of life through presence. The days began to carry a faint weight that Rick had not noticed before. Not a burden, exactly, but a quiet tension that seemed to drift into his awareness in the soft hours of morning, when the light was pale and the world had not yet stirred. He realized with a gentle start that attention and empathy, those subtle powers he had begun to cultivate, also carried responsibility. There were moments when the world resisted, when patterns did not bend, when hearts did not respond, and, in those moments, he felt a flicker of uncertainty, a small shadow creeping at the edges of his calm. One afternoon, Rick and Elliot wandered to the edge of the lot, where the grass met a low stone wall. Rick paused, noticing a small cluster of flowers that had failed to bloom despite his careful attention. He pressed his fingers lightly to the soil, whispering soft encouragement, but the petals remained closed, heavy with their own quiet refusal. Elliot knelt beside him, a small frown tugging at his lips. Maybe they don't want to, he murmured. Rick nodded, but the thought did not settle easily. The idea that attention could not always produce change, that effort might meet resistance, sent a small tremor through his heart. As they moved through the lot, Rick began to notice other subtle hesitations, the way shadows lingered too long in corners, the way a fallen leaf refused to settle, the faint shiver of insects that seemed to retreat from his touch. Each observation carried a quiet lesson. Influence was not mastery, control was an illusion, and even the gentlest care could not guarantee response. Rick felt a flutter of doubt, a soft whisper of inadequacy, as if he had mistaken presence for power and attention for certainty. That evening, at home, he opened his journal with a trembling hand. The pages, usually a source of solace, now reflected the quiet tension within him. He sketched the flowers, the shadows, the leaf that refused to settle, annotating each with notes on resistance, patience, and uncertainty. He wrote of the hum of attention that had once seemed to ripple freely, now encountering friction in the smallest of spaces. And as he wrote, he felt both the weight of responsibility and the soft reassurance that the world's responses, whether cooperative or resistant, were not failures, but part of a larger rhythm he was only beginning to understand. Later, he found Elliot sitting quietly by the window, the fading light brushing his hair with gold. Rick approached slowly, sensing that the boy had noticed the subtle tremor in his mood. "It's okay," Elliot said softly, without expectation. "Even the hardest things have their own time." Rick felt the words sink into him, slow and deliberate, and he realized that part of his quiet heroism was not to force outcomes but to bear witness, to remain present, and to accept the ebb and flow of influence with patience and grace. Sleep that night arrived with a different cadence. Rick lay beneath his ceiling, eyes tracing the faint shimmer of stars through the curtains, and felt the soft pulse of the world at the edges of perception. Resistance and doubt were not enemies. They were teachers. The moments when the world did not bend, when effort met hesitation, were part of a delicate dialogue that required observation, patience, and gentle courage. Even in frustration there was understanding. Even in stillness there was learning. And as his mind drifted toward dreams, Rick carried the quiet knowledge that his power was not in mastery, not in certainty, but in presence, empathy, and enduring attentiveness. Each hesitation, each moment of resistance, each unanswered ripple in the world was a reminder that life's quiet patterns unfolded according to their own rhythms, and that his role was to move gently alongside them, to notice, to participate, and to honor what was, rather than demand what should be. Somewhere in the hush of night, the faint hum of unseen presences lingered, soft and patient, affirming that Rick's journey, though touched by doubt, resistance, and quiet uncertainty, was unfolding exactly as it should. He was learning not only to shape life through attention, but to accept life as it unfolded, to respect the boundaries of influence, and to cultivate the enduring courage of quiet presence, even when answers did not come, even when the world whispered its subtle refusal, and even when the heart met its own uncertainties. Morning arrived with a soft hush, the sunlight filtering through the curtains in delicate, trembling streams that painted the walls in quiet gold. Rick lay for a moment, still wrapped in the lingering warmth of sleep, feeling the subtle pulse of his own heartbeat mingling with the rhythm of the world outside. The previous day's doubts and hesitations had not vanished, but neither had the sense of connection, the faint hum of empathy, and the gentle thrill of noticing life in its smallest forms. Something had shifted, quietly, beneath the surface. He was beginning to recognize not just the world's patterns, but the contours of his own inner landscape. He rose slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath his bare feet, and wandered toward the window. The lot beyond lay bathed in morning light, the sapling bending slightly with the breeze, the moss still stubborn in places, the puddles shimmering with quiet reflection. Each element held a lesson, but today Rick felt drawn inward, tracing the patterns not just outside, but inside himself. He realized that the same patience, attentiveness, and quiet respect he offered the world could, and perhaps must, be extended to his own thoughts and feelings, especially the ones that flickered with doubt and uncertainty. Elliot arrived shortly afterward, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He had sensed, perhaps, the shift in Rick's energy, the inward turn that marked the beginnings of self-reflection. Together they wandered toward the lot, moving slowly as always, tracing the familiar paths, observing the play of light across leaves and grass. But Rick noticed the subtle difference in his own presence. He was listening not only to the world, but to himself, aware of the gentle tension of his shoulders, the quiet flutter of thoughts, the soft ache of expectation. Listening, he discovered, was not a skill reserved for nature alone. It was a dialogue with one's own heart, a recognition of internal rhythms alongside external ones. In the middle of the lot, Rick knelt beside the stubborn moss, the same patch that had resisted his care before. He pressed his hand lightly to the earth and felt its texture, its quiet persistence, its refusal to yield. But this time, instead of frustration, he felt curiosity. Gentle, patient, forgiving. He realized that the moss, like himself, had its own rhythms, its own time, its own way of existing in the world. And in that moment he understood a truth he had only glimpsed before. Patience for the world begins with patience for oneself. Elliot, observing him quietly, seemed to sense this revelation, and a small nod passed between them, unspoken but deeply understood. The hours unfolded in a rhythm of observation and quiet introspection. Rick traced patterns of light on the ground, sketched the lot and its small wonders in his journal, and allowed himself to notice not just the world, but his own shifting moods and thoughts. He began to recognize the interplay of doubt and hope, effort and acceptance, curiosity and restraint. The small flickers of resistance he had encountered in plants, shadows, and moments of human connection now mirrored the subtle hesitations within himself, and he realized that growth was as much inward as outward. By evening, Rick had begun to notice the gentle consequences of internal attentiveness. His patience with the world deepened, his awareness of others' needs sharpened, and a soft resilience settled into the spaces where doubt had once flickered. He recognized that influence, empathy, and quiet heroism were not simply acts directed outward. They were cultivated from a foundation of self-understanding, self-compassion, and gentle reflection. Even the faint light in the corner of his room seemed to shimmer longer, as if acknowledging the new harmony he was discovering between inner and outer awareness. That night, as he lay beneath the ceiling, the stars peeking through the curtains, Rick felt a quiet exhale of relief and understanding. He knew that doubts and hesitations would return, that challenges were inevitable, but he also sensed a resilience taking root, a patient strength born of listening to the world, to others, and to himself. And as sleep drew him into its embrace, he carried the soft certainty that the journey of quiet heroism required not only attention and empathy, but also a gentle acceptance of one's own limits, rhythms, and inner patterns, a recognition that the world and the self are intertwined in a dialogue of patient presence. Somewhere in the hush of night, the faint hum of unseen presences lingered at the edges of awareness, soft and approving, affirming that Rick's journey, though quiet, reflective, and filled with the subtleties of internal growth, was unfolding exactly as it should, guiding him gently toward a deeper understanding of empathy, patience, and the courage to honor both life and self. The morning arrived with a quiet clarity. The sky washed in soft pastels that seemed almost hesitant, as though the day itself was pausing to breathe. Rick lingered at the window for a long moment, feeling the gentle pull of curiosity stir within him. The lot, the sapling, the stubborn moss, they were familiar, almost like old companions, but today something beyond their edges seemed to hum, faint and almost imperceptible, at the corners of his awareness. It was a whisper of possibility, the quiet suggestion that the world held more mysteries than he had yet discovered, and that these mysteries were not distant or unreachable, but woven into the ordinary fabric of life itself. Elliot arrived soon after, carrying a sketchbook and a small satchel filled with pencils. The boy had begun to develop his own rhythm of attentiveness, a soft echo of Rick's careful observation, and together they wandered toward the lot in companionable silence. The sapling swayed gently with the morning breeze, its leaves catching, the light in patterns that shifted and shimmered almost like a secret language. Rick knelt beside it, tracing the curve of a branch with his fingers, and felt the subtle, familiar pulse of life beneath the surface. But today he was aware of something more, a faint resonance that seemed to extend beyond the lot, reaching toward places he could not yet see. As they explored, Rick began to notice the smallest, almost imperceptible details that hinted at hidden patterns. The way the wind bent around a cluster of stones, the slight shimmer of a puddle that seemed to ripple without cause, the soft pause of a bird mid-flight as it crossed a patch of sunlight. Each observation carried a quiet sense of wonder, as though the world were quietly revealing its hidden rhythms to him, inviting him to participate without demand or expectation. Elliot, sensing Rick's focus, mirrored his attention, and together they began to trace these patterns, moving slowly, deliberately, in a shared dance of observation and reflection. Rick felt a subtle shift within himself as he noticed the world's hidden language. It was not just the outer world that responded to attention. His own senses seemed heightened, attuned to the softest vibrations of life and light. Shadows that had once appeared still now seemed to dance with purpose, small. Insects moved with deliberate intention, and the faint hum of energy beneath the surface of the lot resonated with his own heartbeat. He realized that his quiet attentiveness was both a lens and a bridge, revealing mysteries he could not yet name, and connecting him to the life around him in ways he was only beginning to understand. By midday, the lot had become a canvas for discovery. Rick and Elliot moved from one corner to another, sketching, tracing, and noting the faint correspondences between movement, light, and sound. Rick began to notice patterns of interconnection that were subtle but undeniable. A leaf shifting with the wind might cause a ripple in the reflection of a puddle. A bird's wing beat might scatter sunlight across a patch of moss in a way that mirrored the sway of the sapling. These were small mysteries, almost imperceptible, yet they carried the weight of something profound, the idea that the world's hidden rhythms were alive, responsive, and waiting to be noticed with patience and care. As afternoon folded into evening, Rick paused to rest against the low stone wall at the edge of the lot. He felt a quiet gratitude for Elliot's presence, for the lessons of patience, empathy, and quiet attentiveness that had been slowly revealed over days and weeks. And he understood, in a gentle, almost lyrical way, that these subtle mysteries were not simply curiosities to be catalogued. They were invitations to listen, to observe, and to participate in a rhythm of life that was both fragile and enduring, delicate and infinitely connected. That night, as Rick lay beneath the ceiling, the faint stars peeking through the curtains, he carried the soft certainty that his journey was expanding. The world held more than he could yet see, more than he could yet name, and yet each observation, each act of attentiveness, each ripple of quiet presence brought him closer to understanding the invisible patterns that connected life. And somewhere, beyond sight and hearing, a faint hum of acknowledgement lingered at the edges of perception, soft and patient, as if affirming that Rick's quiet exploration of hidden mysteries was unfolding exactly as it should, guiding him gently toward deeper insight, patience, and wonder. The morning light arrived softly, brushing across the lot with the gentlest of warmth, and Rick felt an almost imperceptible tension of expectation settle in his chest. It was not urgency or worry, but a quiet curiosity, the kind that hints at the presence of something meaningful just beyond immediate perception. He wandered among the familiar plants and stones, noting the faint shimmer of dew on leaves, the subtle bends of branches, and the delicate hum of life around him. Today, it seemed, the lot was alive not only with nature, but with memory, patterns that carried emotional resonance he had not yet fully understood. Elliot arrived, carrying a small bundle of sketches he had made the night before, and together they moved slowly through the space, tracing the familiar paths. Rick's attention was drawn not just to movement or light, but to the feelings embedded in each moment. The persistence of a stubborn moss patch spoke of quiet resilience, the sway of the sapling whispered patience, and even the small puddles reflected more than sunlight. They mirrored the subtle motions of thought, attention, and care. Rick began to sense that the hidden patterns he had observed were not merely visual or physical, but emotional, resonating through space in ways that could touch hearts as well as senses. They paused near the edge of the lot, where a low stone wall separated them from the street. Across the way, a woman tended her small garden, and Rick noticed the same subtle shifts he had observed before. Her posture, the timing of her steps, the gentle modulation of her breath. He realized now that the emotional resonance of attention extended beyond himself and Elliot. Even the smallest gestures of care, patience, or recognition had an echo, sometimes delayed, sometimes faint, but undeniably present. The realization settled over him with a warm clarity. Influence was not measured in immediate result, but in the invisible threads of feeling and connection woven quietly between beings. As they wandered further, Rick observed a small boy sitting on the curb, scribbling shapes into the cracked pavement. The child seemed absorbed, unaware of the world around him, yet when Rick's gaze lingered, there was a slight lift in his shoulders, a soft shift in posture that mirrored the gentle acknowledgement of presence. Elliot nudged Rick's arm gently. "He feels it too," he whispered. Rick nodded, feeling a soft thrill of understanding. It was one thing to influence plants and puddles, another entirely to sense the emotional currents in another human being, delicate as they were. This quiet resonance was fragile, subtle, and infinitely precious. The afternoon unfolded in a rhythm of observation and reflection. Rick sketched the lot, the sapling, the puddles, and the small figures that had drifted near, annotating each, with notes about emotional resonance, patience, and the quiet effects of attention. He began to recognize the ways feelings could ripple outward, sometimes imperceptible but persistent, and that these ripples were not simply reactions. They were forms of communication, subtle acknowledgments that crossed the invisible boundaries between self and world. Elliot mirrored his movements, noting each soft discovery, and Rick felt a gentle pride in their shared awareness, the deepening bond forged not in words but in the quiet, attentive presence they offered to each other and to life. By evening, Rick felt a profound sense of gratitude settle in his chest. The patterns of the day, the echoes of influence, the subtle emotional currents, the tiny gestures of presence had taught him that heroism was not in action alone, but in awareness, empathy, and the patient observation of life's small yet profound rhythms. Even the shadows seemed to shimmer with meaning, the wind hummed with gentle purpose, and the faint flicker of the light in his room mirrored the steady glow of understanding that had begun to anchor him. That night, as Rick lay beneath the ceiling, the faint stars peeking through the curtains, he reflected on the quiet power of attention, the gentle resonance of empathy, and the emotional threads that wove themselves subtly but persistently between beings. He understood now that influence and connection were inseparable from patience, reflection, and care, and that the smallest gestures, an acknowledgement, a presence, a shared glance, could ripple through the world in ways both visible and invisible. And as sleep embraced him, he felt the soft certainty that his journey, though quiet and reflective, was unfolding exactly as it should, guiding him gently toward deeper understanding, connection, and the quiet courage to honor both the world and the hearts within it. The morning arrived in a hush of gold and mist, the kind of quiet that invites attention without demanding it. Rick lingered by the window for a long moment, watching the dew glint across the lot, the sapling's leaves swaying softly in the breeze. The world seemed almost to breathe in rhythm with him, each movement subtle but deliberate, each shift of light carrying a hint of possibility. Today, he sensed, there were lessons to be found not in stillness alone, but in the layered interactions that unfolded when presence met response, when attention touched multiple lives at once. Elliot joined him shortly after, carrying his sketchbook and a quiet enthusiasm that had become an extension of Rick's own reflective pace. Together they wandered to the lot, moving slowly, tracing paths they had traversed countless times before, yet seeing them with fresh awareness. Rick noticed that the subtle emotional currents he had felt in isolation now overlapped, creating patterns that were richer, more complex. The saplings swayed, the moss trembled, and even the wind seemed to carry whispers from one point to another, a network of soft resonance that connected life, attention, and emotion in ways he was only beginning to perceive. A small group of children had drifted near the lot that morning, drawn by curiosity or by the faint hum of activity they could not quite name. Rick watched as they approached, tentative and unsure, their small gestures hesitant. Normally, he had observed these moments quietly, letting presence ripple without interference. But today, he sensed a subtle choice before him: to intervene, to gently guide, or to simply witness the natural unfolding of their curiosity. He chose a middle path, allowing his attention to hover lightly, a soft encouragement rather than a directive. Elliot mirrored him, learning through silent example, and together they created a space where observation and presence were felt, even without spoken words. the children began to interact with the lot differently than they had before. One traced patterns in the moss, another balanced on the low stone wall, a third paused to watch the small ripples of sunlight across a puddle. Rick noticed the way their attention shifted, how their movements began to echo the rhythms he had cultivated. Slow, deliberate, mindful. He felt the subtle resonance of empathy extend outward, bridging his own awareness, Elliot's gentle attentiveness, and the children's unformed curiosity. Each gesture, each pause, each glance created a ripple, unseen yet deeply felt, weaving an intricate web of connection that reminded him of the fragile power of presence. By midday, Rick had begun to observe not just outward responses but internal transformations. The children were calmer, more attuned to the textures of the lot, more aware of the play of light and shadow. They mirrored the patience he had learned to cultivate within himself, a reflection of attentiveness that was both humbling and quietly thrilling. He realized that the subtleties of influence were never about control, but about creating conditions where attention and care could flourish naturally, allowing curiosity, patience, and empathy to emerge organically. As the afternoon faded into the soft hues of evening, Rick and Elliot paused beneath the low stone wall, letting the children explore freely while they observed. Rick felt a profound sense of gratitude settle over him. Each ripple of attention, each subtle resonance of feeling, each quiet gesture had combined to create a small ecosystem of awareness, one that included him, Elliot, the children, and the natural world around them. The lesson was clear. Heroism was not in grand acts or dramatic interventions, but in the patient cultivation of presence, in the gentle shaping of emotional currents, in the quiet acknowledgement of life's interconnected rhythms. That night, as Rick lay beneath the soft canopy of his ceiling, the faint stars peeking through the curtains, he reflected on the day's layered interactions. The lot, the children, Elliot, the sapling, the moss, all of it had been part of a delicate, living dialogue that responded to attention and care. He understood now that empathy was not linear, not a simple cause and effect, but a subtle, complex interplay of presence, observation, and respect for the rhythms of life. And as sleep embraced him, he carried the gentle certainty that his quiet journey, though filled with layered, subtle challenges, was unfolding as it should, guiding him toward deeper understanding, connection, and the enduring courage to honor both the world and the hearts within it. The morning unfolded like a slow sigh, the sky painted in soft hues of lavender and gold, and Rick felt a gentle anticipation, a quiet curiosity about what the day might reveal. The lot seemed to hum with a faint energy, as if aware of the previous day's layered interactions. Even the sapling, bending with the morning breeze, seemed to carry a faint echo of attention, a soft acknowledgement of the presence that had lingered around it. Rick stepped into the familiar space with a lightness he had not known before, carrying the subtle awareness that influence was a delicate, ongoing dialogue rather than a single act. Elliot appeared soon after, sketchbook in hand, his steps slow and deliberate, attuned to the rhythms Rick had begun to teach through example. Today, there was an unspoken agreement between them. They would not only observe the world, but also notice the subtle consequences of attention, the faint ripples that extended beyond immediate perception. Even the smallest gestures, the brushing of a hand against moss, the gentle placement of a stone, the tilt of a head towards sunlight, were worthy of patient observation, for they might carry lessons unseen, yet deeply felt. As they wandered through the lot, Rick began to notice something new. The consequences of past attentiveness were appearing in unexpected ways. A puddle that had been ignored for days now reflected patterns of light in delicate, shifting geometries. The moss, once stubborn and resistant, had begun to soften in patches, responding not immediately, but gradually, in subtle agreement with the patience that had been offered. Rick felt a quiet thrill at this slow, almost imperceptible transformation. It was not mastery, but partnership, not control, but a dialogue conducted in stillness and respect. Children began to appear near the edges of the lot, drawn as if by the faint hum of life, their small movements curious and exploratory. Rick observed them carefully, noticing how the echoes of previous days' attentiveness shaped their interactions. They hesitated before stepping on fragile leaves, mirrored the gentle rhythm of his own gestures, and even paused to notice the play of sunlight across the sapling. Rick realized with a soft awe that the ripples of influence were extending outward, layering upon each other, creating subtle networks of care, attention, and quiet understanding that he could feel but not control. By midday, the complexity of these interactions became apparent. A child accidentally displaced a stone, sending a small cascade of leaves tumbling. Rick and Elliot watched, noting the immediate tension in the child's movements, the subtle response of the moss, and the sapling to the disturbance. Rick reached out with quiet presence, not to correct or intervene, but to offer calm attentiveness. Slowly, the child's shoulders relaxed, the leaves settled, and the gentle balance of the lot returned. Rick felt a profound sense of the layered consequences of attention. Every gesture, even unintended, carried subtle emotional and physical echoes. As the afternoon unfolded, Rick's awareness deepened. He noticed that influence was rarely linear, often delayed, and sometimes unpredictable. A gesture he had thought inconsequential, a glance, a soft word, a gentle touch, could ripple outward, touching others in ways he did not immediately perceive. And equally, the world often responded in unexpected ways, reminding him that his role was not to command, but to notice, to respect, and to allow the quiet currents of connection to guide him. By evening, Rick paused on the low stone wall at the lot's edge, reflecting on the unfolding complexity of attention and its subtle consequences. He felt a quiet satisfaction, tempered by humility, knowing that heroism was not measured by results but by presence, patience, and the gentle acknowledgement of life's interconnected rhythms. Elliot sat beside him, their shared silence resonant with understanding, and together they watched the sun lower, the light casting soft shadows across the lot, shadows that seemed to dance with the faint hum of interaction, reflection, and quiet learning. That night, as Rick lay beneath the ceiling, the stars peeking through the curtains, he reflected on the unexpected consequences of attentiveness. Influence was not simple or immediate, but a layered, evolving dialogue that required patience, empathy, and humility, even when outcomes were uncertain, even when ripples reached far beyond his comprehension. The act of presence itself carried meaning, and as sleep embraced him, he carried the soft certainty that his quiet journey, shaped by awareness, care, and reflection, was unfolding exactly as it should, guiding him gently toward deeper understanding, connection, and the courage to honor both life and the delicate currents of emotion within it. The morning arrived with a quiet hesitance, as if the day itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Rick lingered at the window, observing the familiar lot bathed in gentle light, yet sensing a subtle tension in the air he could not immediately name. The previous days had taught him the rhythm of patience, attentiveness, and gentle influence, yet today he felt the first stirrings of uncertainty, the kind that whispers that intentions, no matter how careful, might meet resistance, misinterpretation, or outcomes beyond one's control. Elliot arrived shortly, his sketchbook tucked under his arm, a quiet energy that reflected both curiosity and expectation. Together they stepped into the lot, moving slowly, deliberately, noticing the faint changes in the leaves, the light, and even the moss that had begun to yield to their patient attention. Yet Rick sensed subtle shifts in the environment that suggested tension beneath the surface, a puddle that rippled without apparent cause, a cluster of leaves trembling against the wind, a shadow that lingered longer than usual. He realized that the delicate balance they had cultivated was not immutable. Even the smallest actions could create unexpected reverberations. As they explored, a small group of children wandered near the lot, curious but hesitant. Rick noticed the careful way they moved, the way their eyes lingered on the sapling, the puddles and the moss, attempting to navigate a space shaped by previous attentiveness. One child reached for a fragile plant, misjudging the distance, and the branch bent sharply, breaking with a soft snap. Rick felt a faint rush of tension, a mixture of empathy and caution, and instinctively approached, not to scold or correct, but to offer a calming presence. He knelt beside the child, speaking softly, acknowledging the mistake without judgment, letting his attention ripple into reassurance. The child's shoulders relaxed, and a faint smile returned. Rick felt a soft exhale of relief, but he also noted the complexity of consequences. Every intention carried both risk and potential reward. Every gesture shaped the world in ways subtle, unpredictable, and sometimes beyond comprehension. Throughout the morning, Rick observed the unfolding interplay of intention and outcome. A puddle that had been undisturbed shifted when a child stepped nearby, casting new reflections across the sapling. A leaf, nudged too forcefully, fluttered and landed in a patch of moss, subtly altering the balance of the lot. Rick realized that the quiet heroism he had cultivated, the attentiveness, patience, and empathy, was now being tested. Outcomes were no longer simple echoes of presence. They were layered, dynamic, and fragile. And in that realization, he felt the faint thrill of understanding. True influence was never absolute. By midday, Rick found a quiet corner of the lot to sit, sketching the interactions, noting the subtle ripples of consequence, the ways small gestures interacted, collided, or aligned. He recognized that growth, both in himself and in those around him, required acceptance of uncertainty. Not every act of care would be perfectly received. Not every gesture would yield visible or immediate reward. Yet, even in the unpredictable, there was meaning. The commitment to presence, the intention to nurture, and the willingness to remain calm amidst uncertainty were themselves acts of quiet heroism. As the afternoon waned, Rick and Elliot sat together, beneath the low stone wall, observing the children's exploration, noticing how their small mistakes, their adjustments, and their recoveries mirrored the rhythm of life itself. Imperfect, layered, responsive. Rick felt a profound appreciation for the complexity of connection, for the subtle dance of attention and consequence, and for the courage required to continue offering presence and care when outcomes could not be fully controlled. That evening, as Rick lay beneath his ceiling, the stars peeking through the curtains, he reflected on the subtle tension between intention and result. He realized that influence was never linear, never predictable, but always meaningful when rooted in empathy, patience, and awareness. Even when ripples met resistance or drifted unexpectedly, the act of attentiveness carried enduring value. And as sleep drew him into its embrace, he carried the quiet certainty that his journey, though layered, fragile, and unpredictable, was unfolding exactly as it should, guiding him gently toward deeper understanding, presence, and the courage to honor life in all its intricate, shifting patterns. The morning emerged gently, the sky painted in quiet shades of peach and rose, carrying a softness that seemed to ripple across the lot itself. Rick lingered at the window for a few breaths longer than usual, noting the subtle changes that had begun to accumulate in the space over time, the moss more resilient, the puddles reflecting light in shifting patterns, the sapling leaning slightly, as if in quiet acknowledgement of his persistent care. Today, he sensed, he would observe not just immediate responses, but the long-term echoes of patience, attention, and gentle guidance, a rhythm that unfolded slowly yet persistently. Elliot arrived, carrying his sketchbook and a faint sense of anticipation. Together they walked through the lot, noticing details that had previously escaped attention, the way the wind bent around clusters of leaves, the subtle dance of shadows across the moss, the faint impressions left by past footsteps now forming delicate patterns. Rick felt a deep, calm understanding settle within him. Growth and influence were not measured by immediate changes, but by the subtle accumulation of effort, attention, and care. The world responded not instantly, but gradually in quiet, often imperceptible ways that demanded patience and a gentle attentiveness to notice. The children appeared once more, their curiosity tempered by previous visits, their movements reflecting a soft awareness of the lot's fragile rhythms. Rick observed the patterns of their attention, the ways they approached the moss, the sapling, and the puddles with newfound respect, pausing longer to consider the impact of their actions. Small gestures, a careful placement of a stone, a hesitant step around a patch of moss, a whisper to a sibling, revealed a growing sensitivity that mirrored Rick's own efforts to honor the space and those within it. He realized that the subtle accumulation of attentiveness, repeated over time, was shaping not only the environment but the children themselves, nurturing patience, empathy, and awareness that could not be hurried. By midday, Rick moved slowly through the lot, tracing familiar paths, sketching reflections in puddles, and noting the interplay of shadow and light across the moss. He observed that the space itself seemed more responsive, not in dramatic ways, but in gentle acknowledgments of care. Leaves shifted more gracefully in the wind, small insects paused longer on damp earth, and even the sunlight seemed to linger on patterns of movement that had emerged over days and weeks of quiet observation. Each ripple of attention he had offered, each patient gesture, each acknowledgement of subtle currents had accumulated, layering itself into the lot as a living testament to persistence and presence. As the afternoon stretched, Rick noticed the long-term effects of his quiet guidance on the children. Their exploration had become more deliberate, more attuned to subtle changes in the environment and in each other. They noticed patterns he had not explicitly taught, mirrored gestures of patience and care, and even paused to watch natural phenomena with a quiet reverence. Rick felt a profound sense of humility and satisfaction. Influence, he realized, was rarely immediate, and its truest power was often invisible, unfolding gradually in ways that could only be observed with patience and openness. By evening, Rick and Elliot paused beneath the low stone wall at the lot's edge, watching the day fold into the gentle hues of twilight. Rick reflected on the subtle, almost imperceptible consequences of attention over time. Every gesture, every moment of quiet presence, every patient act had accumulated, shaping the lot, the children, and even his own understanding of connection and care. Heroism, he realized, was not measured by singular acts or immediate results, but by persistence, empathy, and the willingness to honor life's delicate rhythms with consistency and humility. That night, as Rick lay beneath the ceiling, the faint stars peeking through the curtains, he felt the quiet exhale of understanding. The long-term echoes of attention, care, and presence had begun to reveal their subtle beauty. He understood now that influence and growth were woven through time, shaped by repeated patience and awareness, and that the most meaningful changes often emerged quietly, almost imperceptibly. And as sleep embraced him, he carried the gentle certainty that his journey, layered, persistent, and attuned to the quiet currents of life, was unfolding exactly as it should, guiding him gently toward deeper understanding, connection, and the courage to honor both the world and the hearts within it. The morning began with a soft, diffused light, the kind that made the edges of the lot seem to blur, as though the world itself were breathing quietly. Rick moved slowly through the familiar space, noting the subtle patterns that had emerged over time, the moss yielding to gentle steps, the sapling leaning in quiet acknowledgement of care, the puddles catching reflections that shifted imperceptibly with the day's progression. Today, however, there was a new layer to observe: tension, not in the environment itself, but in the subtle currents of emotion that threaded through the interactions of those around him. Elliot appeared shortly after, carrying his sketchbook and a faint furrow of thought. He mirrored Rick's deliberate movements, pausing to observe leaves, puddles, and the faint play of sunlight, but Rick noticed the boy's subtle unease. A small dispute had arisen among the children who had been visiting the lot, a disagreement over which patch of moss to explore, which stone to examine. Rick felt a gentle pull of concern, tempered by the understanding that these tensions were not obstacles, but opportunities to observe, to guide, without imposing, to nurture resolution through presence rather than force. He approached the children, slowly, kneeling at their level, offering quiet acknowledgement of their emotions without judgment. "I see that you're upset," he said softly, letting his voice carry a calm weight. "And that's okay. Let's notice what's happening together." The words were simple, but his attentiveness acted as a subtle invitation for the children to mirror patience, to recognize not only their own feelings but those of others. Rick sensed the shift almost imperceptibly. Shoulders relaxed, voices softened, and a tentative curiosity returned to their eyes, as if the tension were a small wave settling back into the gentle rhythm of the lot. Elliot observed closely, taking note of Rick's method, not of intervention, but of empathetic presence. The boy's understanding of the subtle currents of emotional resonance deepened as he watched Rick navigate the delicate space between acknowledgement and influence. Even the youngest child, who had been the loudest in disagreement, paused and began to notice the faint shifts in the leaves, the patterns of shadow, the soft alignment of attention among those gathered. It was a small, almost invisible transformation, yet it carried the weight of quiet learning, the understanding that presence and patience could ripple through tension in ways words alone might never accomplish. By midday, Rick had moved among the children, the moss, and the sapling, observing the interwoven consequences of attention and emotion. He noticed that even subtle missteps, a hurried glance, a pulled leaf, a louder voice, created faint ripples that influenced others. And yet, when met with calm attentiveness, those ripples could settle, merge, and transform into understanding. The lesson was clear. Relationships, like the lot, required patience, observation, and gentle guidance. Outcomes could not be forced, but they could be encouraged to unfold naturally. The afternoon deepened, light shifting to warmer, gentler tones, and Rick felt a profound awareness of the complexity of human connection. The lot had become a living classroom of empathy, reflection, and patient influence. Even the moss and puddles seemed to participate, responding subtly to the cadence of care, the rhythm of attentiveness the quiet modulation of emotion. Rick understood, more fully than ever, that heroism was not about control or immediate resolution, but about cultivating the conditions in which understanding, patience, and emotional resonance could flourish. As evening approached, Rick and Elliot sat quietly beneath the low stone wall. The children dispersed around the lot, each absorbed in their own explorations, yet subtly aware of one another. Rick reflected on the subtle tensions of the day, the invisible threads of emotion, and the gentle shifts brought about by attentiveness. He realized that navigating relationships, whether with children, with friends, or with life itself, required presence, patience, and the willingness to observe without judgment. That night, as Rick lay beneath the ceiling, the faint stars visible, through the curtains, he carried the quiet realization that relationships like the lot were living, breathing systems of interaction. Each ripple of emotion, each patient gesture, each careful observation contributed to the slow shaping of understanding. And as sleep embraced him, he felt the calm certainty that his journey, though layered, fragile, and sometimes unpredictable, was unfolding as it should, guiding him gently toward deeper empathy, connection, and the quiet courage to honor both the world and the hearts within it. The morning unfolded in a quiet hush, as if the world itself were leaning forward to listen. Rick lingered at the window, watching the soft light ripple across the lot, and noticed, almost imperceptibly, that time had begun to layer itself into the space. Moss that had once been tender now bore a certain sturdiness. Puddles, previously transient and fleeting, held reflections longer, as if memory itself had settled into their still waters. Rick realized with a gentle awe that his quiet attentiveness had left traces far beyond immediate perception. The lot had begun to hold echoes of past presence, a subtle testimony to the patient rhythms of care and observation. Elliot joined him shortly, carrying his sketchbook and a sense of anticipation. Together, they moved through the lot, their steps, slow, deliberate, attuned not only to physical shifts, but to the invisible currents of memory and influence that wove through the space. Children from previous days had not arrived, yet Rick sensed their subtle marks in the air, the curve of a leaf pressed down by tiny feet, a faint indentation in the moss, a shimmer of light where puddles had reflected curiosity. These were quiet, traces of intergenerational presence, delicate patterns that held the lessons of observation, care, and attention. Rick walked slowly to the sapling, now taller, its slender trunk bending slightly as though acknowledging his ongoing attentiveness. He knelt and traced a finger along the edge of a leaf, feeling not only the texture but the layered echoes of past gestures, the children's careful steps, Elliot's patient movements, his own reflective attention. There was an almost imperceptible dialogue unfolding between past and present, a conversation that did not require words, but carried meaning nonetheless. He felt a profound reverence for the accumulation of small, patient gestures over time, and a deep understanding that influence was rarely immediate, but always lasting in quiet, often invisible ways. By midday, Rick noticed a new pattern emerging. In the lot, the interactions between past and present had begun to shape behavior. A small group of children from the neighborhood wandered near, hesitating at the edge of the lot, as if sensing its unusual calm. Rick observed how they moved, how they paused before stepping on moss, how their eyes lingered on the sapling and the puddles. They were intuitively responding to the echoes of presence, to patterns established long before their arrival, and he felt a quiet thrill at the subtle reach of patient attention. The past, it seemed, was teaching the present without force, without instruction, but through resonance and example. Elliot watched alongside him, sketching the children's tentative steps and the subtle responses of the lot, noting how traces of care could ripple across time. "They feel it, don't they?" Elliot whispered, almost to himself. Rick nodded, feeling the gentle warmth of shared understanding. The children's hesitation, their careful observation, their mimicry of patient attention, all of it reflected the accumulation of quiet influence that had unfolded over weeks, perhaps months. Even in their small, unknowing gestures there was continuity, an intergenerational echo of care that extended beyond conscious awareness. As the afternoon deepened, Rick moved among the children and the lot, noticing small interactions, a careful placement of a stone, a pause to watch sunlight shimmer on a puddle, a shared glance between two children who had never met before. Each movement carried the weight of accumulated attentiveness, both past and present, and Rick recognized the subtle but profound power of presence extended over time. The lot had become a living archive of quiet heroism, a space where empathy, patience, and reflection had layered into patterns that could guide, teach, and influence without ever imposing. By evening, Rick and Elliot sat quietly on the low stone wall, the sun casting long shadows across the lot, each one softened by the subtle interplay of memory and attention. Rick felt the calm certainty that the quiet acts of presence, the attentiveness, patience, and care were accumulating, shaping both environment and heart, echoing across time. He realized that the truest form of influence was not immediate or visible, but enduring, woven into the rhythms of life itself. And as sleep claimed him later that night, he carried the gentle understanding that his journey, layered, subtle, and patient, was unfolding as it should, guiding him toward deeper awareness, connection, and the quiet courage to honor the traces of hearts past and present. The morning light arrived with a tender hush, spilling softly across the lot, catching the edges of the sapling's leaves and the gentle contours of moss that had grown over weeks of careful attention. Rick lingered at the edge of the lot, feeling the subtle interplay of time and presence around him, sensing that today the patterns would reveal themselves in ways he had not yet fully noticed. There was a quiet poetry in the air, a rhythm that seemed to hum faintly beneath the surface, a harmony of observation, patience, and accumulated care. Elliot appeared soon after, his steps slow, measured, attuned to the nuances of the space, as if he could feel the weight of previous interactions pressing gently into the present. They moved together through the lot, noting the soft interplay of shadow and light, the delicate shift of puddles, the sway of the sapling, and the moss, now yielding in places that had resisted weeks ago. Each element bore evidence of the layered attentiveness that had passed through it, and Rick felt a deep, meditative joy in witnessing the subtle poetry of consequence unfolding. Children arrived once again, drawn as if by the faint hum of care that lingered in the lot, their movements tentative, reflective of the patterns left by prior attention. Rick observed quietly, noticing how each step, pause, and gesture carried traces of previous days' lessons. A child crouched beside a puddle, noticing the play of sunlight across it. Another traced patterns in the moss, mirroring the patience that had been silently modeled for weeks. Rick felt a quiet awe at the way attention had layered, creating a subtle network of awareness that guided without command, influenced without instruction. By midday, Rick began to see patterns he had only sensed before, the invisible connections between environment and emotion, past and present, intention and response. A ripple in a puddle shifted light across the moss, which seemed to encourage careful steps from a child approaching it. A small breeze moved leaves, and another child paused, sensing the gentle choreography of movement and attention, seemingly without knowing why. Rick realized that the lot had become a living poem, its verses composed of attention, empathy, patience, and subtle interactions that unfolded across time and space. Elliot noticed, too, sketching in quiet focus, and whispered softly, "It's like everything is connected, even the smallest gestures." Rick nodded, feeling the truth of it deepen inside him. He understood now that quiet heroism was not the act itself, but the resonance it created, the layered impact that unfolded slowly, touching hearts and minds in ways both seen and unseen. The lot had become a testament to this, a space where influence, care, and attention rippled outward with gentle persistence, shaping not only behavior, but perception, reflection, and understanding. As the afternoon waned, Rick moved slowly, observing the children's careful interactions, noting the interplay of shadows, reflections, and footprints. Every gesture carried weight, every pause had purpose, and every connection seemed imbued with a subtle resonance that could not be hurried or forced. He felt a profound gratitude for the unseen layers of influence, for the patience and attentiveness that had shaped the lot into a space of quiet learning and reflective presence. It was a living embodiment of his ongoing journey, a proof that influence, when offered with empathy and care, could extend far beyond immediate perception. By evening, the light softened to muted gold, spilling across the lot like a quiet benediction. Rick and Elliot sat beneath the low stone wall, the children wandering quietly around them, absorbed in the gentle poetry of movement, observation, and play. Rick reflected on the subtle interweaving of patterns, emotional, environmental, and temporal, and felt the calm certainty that the patient accumulation of attentiveness had created a space alive with resonance, connection, and understanding. That night, as Rick lay beneath the ceiling, stars peeking softly through the curtains, he carried the quiet exhale of satisfaction. The lot, the children, the moss, the puddles, the sapling, all bore traces of care, reflection, and empathy, reminding him that influence was never immediate, yet always enduring. And as sleep embraced him, he felt the gentle assurance that his journey, layered, poetic, and patient, was unfolding exactly as it should, guiding him toward deeper awareness, presence, and the courage to honor both the subtle currents of the world and the hearts that moved within it. The morning arrived with a quiet glow, the kind that seemed to linger longer in the spaces between leaves, puddles, and shadows. Rick stepped into the lot slowly, noticing the faint interplay of light on the moss, the gentle sway of the sapling, and the subtle impressions left by past footsteps. Today there was a feeling in the air that had not been so pronounced before, a sense of connection deeper than mere observation, an almost imperceptible thread linking the children, Elliot, and himself. The lot seemed alive in a more intimate way, as if it had absorbed all previous attentiveness and now pulsed with quiet, gentle energy. Elliot arrived shortly, carrying his sketchbook and a patient smile, mirroring Rick's reflective pace. They began walking through the lot together, each step measured, noticing the smallest movements. A leaf trembling in the breeze, sunlight, catching a ripple in a puddle, the slight curve of moss flattened by prior presence. Rick felt a faint thrill at how patterns had begun to intertwine, physical, emotional, and temporal layers overlapping, creating a subtle network of resonance. The lot, he realized, was no longer simply a space. It had become a living reflection of attention, care, and gentle connection. The children appeared mid-morning, their arrival quiet, hesitant, as if they sensed the deeper rhythms of the space. They moved more deliberately than before, pausing longer to observe the moss, puddles and sapling, and even exchanging glances that suggested an emerging understanding of shared presence. Rick noticed how their gestures echoed patterns established. Over time, a careful touch here, a lingering gaze there, a subtle step back to give room. Each movement carried the weight of prior attentiveness, and Rick felt a quiet wonder at how subtle influence could ripple forward, layering with new awareness in almost imperceptible ways. By midday, Rick began to perceive patterns among the children themselves. Their interactions were no longer simple curiosity. They were dialogues in miniature, shaped by empathy, reflection, and patience. A small dispute over a puddle was resolved through soft guidance, glances, and gestures, not through words or commands. Rick observed the gentle interchange of attention and response, noticing how the children mirrored his own careful patience and Elliot's quiet attentiveness. It was a quiet choreography, a dance of subtle emotions that created harmony without insistence or instruction. As the afternoon stretched, Rick moved slowly, tracing the patterns unfolding around him. He noticed the long-term layering of influence. A child's careful pause reflected not only his own guidance, but the echoes of previous days, the unseen impact of the moss, the sapling, and even the lingering ripples in the puddles. He realized that relationships like the lot were cumulative, shaped over time by repeated gestures, presence, and attention. Every smile, every careful movement, every quiet observation contributed to a complex web of understanding that would persist far beyond the immediate moment. Elliot observed quietly, sketching the subtle interactions, capturing the faint traces of connection that might otherwise go unnoticed. He whispered to Rick, "It's like we're part of something bigger, something that keeps growing even when we're not looking." Rick nodded, feeling the truth of it resonate within him. Influence was not immediate, and heroism was not measured by grand gestures. Instead, it was in these gentle, patient accumulations, in the quiet shaping of understanding, empathy, and presence. The lot had become a sanctuary of soft heroism, a space where subtle currents of connection flowed and intertwined, guiding actions, emotions, and attention alike. By evening, Rick sat on the low stone wall, watching the children disperse with small, careful movements that mirrored the day's lessons. The sun lowered gently, casting a warm glow over the lot, and Rick felt the quiet satisfaction of observing interwoven lives and subtle connections forming, almost dreamlike in their resonance. He realized that patience, attentiveness, and gentle influence could create echoes that extended far beyond immediate perception, shaping both environment and heart. That night, as Rick lay beneath the ceiling, the stars peeking softly through the curtains, he carried the quiet certainty that his journey, layered, patient, and intertwined with the lives around him, was unfolding exactly as it should. Influence, he understood, was subtle, enduring, and deeply poetic, and as sleep embraced him, he felt the gentle assurance that connection, empathy, and quiet attentiveness were guiding him toward deeper understanding, presence, and the courage to honor the hearts within the world around him. The morning arrived, with a gentle hush, the kind that made the edges of the lot seem softer, almost liquid, as though the world were leaning in closer to observe. Rick moved slowly through the familiar paths, noticing the faint traces of past days, the moss pressed just so, the puddles holding reflections longer than usual, the sapling's slender branches stretching toward the pale sun. Today, he sensed, He would witness not just the present echoes of care, but the subtle, almost invisible consequences that had rippled outward, extending beyond immediate perception. Elliot arrived shortly, carrying his sketchbook with the quiet attentiveness he had perfected over weeks of observation. Together they moved through the lot, their steps deliberate, noticing the delicate choreography of shadows, reflections, and the soft movements of the children who had wandered back. Rick felt a quiet thrill at how the world had begun to respond to their presence. Subtle nods in the motion of leaves, faint patterns in the moss, even the pauses and gestures of children that mirrored past attentiveness. These were consequences of a patient rhythm, a layering of care and attention that had grown slowly, almost invisibly, into a living web of interaction. By mid-morning, Rick observed a new layer of influence emerging. A child knelt beside a puddle, tracing ripples with a careful finger, and in the movement he seemed to echo gestures from days before, unaware of the subtle guidance that had shaped him. Another child, hovering near the sapling, hesitated before stepping, as if sensing the delicate balance of life beneath their feet. Rick noticed how these interactions were no longer isolated. They were interconnected, shaped by the accumulation of attention, patience, and gentle guidance. The consequences of presence were spreading, layering themselves into the environment and the hearts of those who engaged with it. Elliot sketched quietly, noting how the interactions reflected unseen patterns, the sort of subtle teaching that could not be rushed or commanded. He whispered softly, "Even the smallest gesture has a story now." Rick nodded, feeling the weight and beauty of it. Influence, he realized, was like sunlight filtering through the leaves. It touched everything, quietly, often unnoticed, yet profoundly transformative. Every careful step, every pause of observation, every empathetic glance had accumulated, creating a network of subtle consequences that rippled outward beyond immediate perception. As the afternoon stretched, Rick wandered further into the lot, noticing how small acts of attentiveness had created spaces of calm. A puddle shimmered with mirrored light, reflecting both the present and traces of past gestures. A patch of moss had grown more resilient, where children had once stepped lightly, their care embedding into the texture of the lot itself. Rick understood now that consequences did not need to be monumental to be meaningful. The quiet layering of attention, patience, and presence had already begun shaping the world in gentle, lasting ways. By evening, the children had dispersed, leaving traces of curiosity, laughter, and small, careful gestures scattered like petals across the lot. Rick and Elliot sat together beneath the low stone wall, watching shadows stretch and merge, noticing how even the light seemed softened, tempered by the cumulative attention of the day. Rick reflected on the invisible threads connecting presence, action, and consequence, recognizing that his quiet attentiveness was creating an enduring rhythm in both environment and heart. The lot had become a living testimony to the subtle poetry of influence, a space where care, empathy, and patience intertwined to shape experiences in ways often unseen yet deeply felt. As night fell, Rick lay beneath the ceiling, the faint glimmer of stars peeking through the curtains, and he felt the soft exhale of understanding. Influence, he realized, was layered, patient, and enduring. Every gesture of attention, every moment of care, every subtle act of empathy had created echoes that extended into the world and into the hearts of others, quietly shaping life in ways that could not be measured immediately. And as sleep embraced him, he carried the calm certainty that his journey, layered, subtle, and profoundly interconnected, was unfolding as it should, guiding him toward deeper awareness, presence, and the courage to honor the unseen ripples of every heart within the world. The morning arrived as if the world were holding its breath, the light stretching softly across the lot, folding shadows into gentle swathes of gold and silver. Rick walked slowly among the moss and puddles, pausing to observe the sapling, now taller and sturdier, leaning as though acknowledging the rhythms of care that had shaped it. There was a faint hum in the air, a resonance, almost imperceptible, as if the echoes of past attentiveness had begun to intertwine with the present in patterns that were quietly poetic. Rick felt it in the pauses between steps, in the shifting of sunlight across puddles, and in the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a subtle breeze. Elliot joined him shortly, sketchbook in hand, his movements mirroring Rick's deliberate attention. Together they moved slowly, attuned to the almost imperceptible currents that connected environment, action, and emotion. The children appeared as well, drawn once more to the lot by forces they could not fully articulate, responding to the quiet poetry that had been cultivated over weeks. They moved carefully, pausing, observing, interacting with the moss, the puddles, and each other in ways that seemed guided not by instruction, but by subtle attunement to the patterns of presence that had been layered into the space. Rick noticed the faintest of changes that morning, a reflection in a puddle lingering a moment longer, a child's gaze catching a ripple in the moss and holding it almost reverently. Each small interaction carried echoes of prior days, gestures, repeated, reflected, and absorbed into the rhythm of the lot. Rick felt a profound awareness of the invisible threads that bound past attentiveness to present behavior, threads that seemed to pulse with quiet, enduring energy. It was as if the lot itself had become a living testament to the accumulation of patient care, the subtle shaping of understanding, and the quiet resonance of presence. By midday, Rick observed a deepening of the interplay between children, environment, and memory. A small disagreement arose over which path to explore first, but it resolved almost imperceptibly through subtle glances, gentle pauses, and a shared sense of awareness. Rick felt a quiet wonder at how attentiveness and patience had created a space where empathy and reflection could flourish naturally without instruction or imposition. Even the youngest child, previously prone to haste, moved with a calm deliberation, guided by the accumulated resonance of prior presence. Elliot sketched quietly, capturing the interplay of light, shadow, and subtle gestures. He whispered softly, "It's like the lot itself is teaching them." Rick nodded, feeling the deep truth in that observation. Influence, he realized, was neither immediate nor forceful. It flowed quietly, layered into each gesture, pause, and observation, extending its reach beyond the immediate moment. The lot had become a living archive of presence, patience, and gentle guidance, a space where emotional resonance, attentiveness, and empathy could ripple outward, shaping both environment and heart. As the afternoon wore on, Rick moved slowly among the children, observing how their interactions had become almost dreamlike. Subtle gestures mirrored across pairs of children, pauses echoing earlier days, smiles shared that seemed to carry understanding unspoken. Even the moss and puddles responded in quiet, imperceptible ways, reflecting light differently, bending subtly beneath careful feet, as though acknowledging the layered attentiveness that had come to define the space. Rick felt a deep reverence for the unseen, almost mystical ways in which patience, observation, and gentle influence shaped both the lot and those who moved within it. By evening, the children dispersed, leaving behind traces of presence, attention, and curiosity that lingered like faint songs in the moss and puddles. Rick and Elliot sat quietly beneath the low stone wall, watching the shadows lengthen and merge with the golden light of dusk. Rick reflected on the subtle yet enduring consequences of patient presence, realizing that influence, empathy, and understanding were woven through time in delicate, almost imperceptible patterns. That night, as he lay beneath the ceiling, stars peeking softly through the curtains, Rick felt the quiet exhale of comprehension. The lot, the children, the moss, the puddles, and the sapling all bore the accumulated traces of attentiveness and care, evidence that influence and connection extended far beyond immediate perception. And as sleep claimed him, he carried the gentle certainty that his journey, layered, patient, and intertwined with the rhythms of life, was unfolding exactly as it should, guiding him toward deeper awareness, connection, and the courage to honor both the seen and unseen currents of the world around him. The morning unfolded with a delicate hush, the sunlight spilling gently across the lot, casting long, soft shadows that seemed to fold in on themselves. Rick wandered slowly along the familiar paths, noting the subtle shifts in the moss, the slight curl of a leaf, the way the sapling's branches arched toward the sun. There was a sense today of something quietly different, a resonance that felt almost sentient, as if the lot itself had absorbed all the attentiveness of past days, and now responded with a tender awareness. He paused, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of continuity pressing softly against his chest, a reminder that influence could ripple silently through time. Elliot appeared shortly, carrying his sketchbook and moving with the same careful, deliberate attention that had become their shared rhythm. Together they navigated the lot, noticing the interplay of light and shadow, puddle reflections, and the gentle bending of moss beneath hesitant footsteps. The children arrived gradually, drawn by an invisible pulse of curiosity and empathy that Rick could feel more strongly than ever. Today, their interactions were quieter, more reflective, almost as if they had absorbed the subtle teachings of previous days and carried them forward instinctively without words. By mid-morning, Rick observed the faint yet profound ways that the lot had begun to shape perception itself. A child paused, gazing into a puddle, tracing ripples that seemed to echo gestures from days prior. Another crouched beside the sapling, gently lifting leaves to see sunlight dancing beneath, her movements mirroring the care she had witnessed in others. Rick felt a quiet wonder at how attention, patience, and empathy had intertwined to create a living web, subtle yet unmistakable. Influence, he realized, was like a thread running through water, invisible yet guiding the current of experience. Elliot, sketching silently, whispered, "It's as if everything here remembers." Rick nodded, feeling the truth of that observation. Every step, every pause, every careful touch was a reflection of layered attentiveness, extending backward and forward in time. The lot itself had become a repository of presence, patience, and subtle guidance, a place where small gestures accumulated into patterns that shaped understanding, reflection, and empathy in ways that could not be hurried or forced. As the afternoons stretched, Rick wandered further, noticing how the children's interactions had taken on a quiet rhythm. Their movements were no longer tentative. They reflected an almost dreamlike awareness of space, of others, of accumulated care. A playful disagreement resolved itself through gentle gestures and glances, a moment of quiet negotiation that carried echoes of prior guidance. The moss, puddles, and saplings seemed to participate, reflecting light differently, yielding beneath careful feet, and adding an almost imperceptible presence to each interaction. Rick felt a deep reverence for the invisible choreography that had emerged a subtle interplay of memory, attention, and quiet guidance shaping the world in ways both seen and unseen. By evening, the children had dispersed, leaving behind traces of curiosity, wonder, and gentle influence that lingered in the moss, puddles, and air itself. Rick and Elliot sat beneath the low stone wall, watching the sun dip low, bathing the lot in muted gold. Rick reflected on the quiet, enduring consequences of attentiveness, realizing that influence was never measured in immediate outcomes, but in the slow, persistent weaving of connection, empathy, and understanding. The lot had become a living testament to this truth, a sanctuary of subtle heroism where small, deliberate acts shaped the present and echoed into the future. As night fell, Rick lay beneath the ceiling, the faint light of stars peeking through the curtains. He felt a soft exhale of comprehension, a recognition that influence, patience, and attentiveness were layered through time, quietly shaping the world and the hearts within it. And as sleep claimed him, he carried the gentle certainty that his journey, layered, reflective, and deeply interconnected, was unfolding exactly as it should, guiding him toward a deeper awareness of presence, connection, and the courage to honor both the seen and unseen currents of life. The morning arrived, with a softness that seemed almost unreal, as if the world had exhaled and settled into itself. Rick walked slowly through the lot, his steps quiet, noticing the way sunlight caught the moss, the slight bend of the sapling, and the faint shimmer of puddles left from a previous drizzle. There was a subtle serenity in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the layers of attention, care, and presence that had accumulated over weeks, shaping the lot into something more than a space. It had become a living reflection of time, empathy, and patience. Elliot joined him soon after, sketchbook in hand, moving with a deliberate care that had become their shared rhythm. Together they observed the lot, the children, the interplay of light and shadow, and the faint patterns emerging across the moss and puddles. Today there was a sense of culmination, a feeling that the subtle currents they had nurtured were now rippling in ways that extended beyond the immediate perception. Each gesture, each pause, each careful observation had built upon the last, creating a web of understanding and reflection that seemed almost tangible in the air. The children arrived mid-morning, their presence gentle, yet resonant, reflecting the rhythms of patience and attentiveness that had been quietly modeled for weeks. They moved deliberately, pausing to trace ripples in puddles, to lift leaves, to mirror one another's gestures with a softness that spoke of unspoken understanding. Rick noticed how their movements were no longer tentative. They carried traces of memory, empathy, and subtle guidance, moving in harmony with the environment and with one another. The lot had become both stage and teacher, offering quiet lessons in observation, care, and the gentle shaping of presence. By midday, Rick began to reflect on the deeper implications of these interwoven moments. The subtle influence of attention, patience, and empathy had created layers of understanding that extended beyond immediate observation. A child's careful pause mirrored a gesture he had not consciously taught, but had simply embodied. Another child's laughter echoed a rhythm of attentiveness that had been nurtured through quiet, consistent presence. Rick felt a soft awe at the enduring consequences of small, deliberate acts, the quiet heroism that required no recognition, no applause, only presence, care, and quiet dedication. Elliot sketched silently, capturing the faint interplay of shadows, light, and subtle human gestures, whispering softly, "It's like we're witnessing something timeless." Rick nodded, understanding that time itself had become a medium, layering experience, attention, and influence in ways that could not be measured but could only be felt. Every step, every glance, every moment of attentiveness had accumulated into a delicate, living network, creating resonance that would persist long after their presence had faded. As the afternoon wore on, Rick wandered among the children, observing the quiet choreography of interactions, the soft exchange of glances, the careful steps around moss and puddles, the almost dreamlike awareness of each movement. He felt a profound reverence for the invisible threads connecting presence, memory, and care, understanding that legacy was not in grand gestures but in the gentle layering of influence over time. Each careful action, each moment of empathy, each attentive pause had woven a pattern that was at once ephemeral and enduring, shaping hearts and minds quietly, invisibly, and profoundly. By evening, the children had dispersed, leaving behind traces of curiosity, wonder, and gentle influence scattered across the lot. Rick and Elliot sat beneath the low stone wall, watching the sun sink low, bathing the moss, sapling, and puddles in a muted, golden light. Rick reflected on the quiet legacy they had cultivated, feeling the weight and beauty of influence, patience, and attentiveness layered over time. The lot was no longer just a space. It was a living testament to the subtle, enduring poetry of presence. That night, as Rick lay beneath the ceiling, stars peeking softly through the curtains, he felt the quiet exhale of reflection. The lot, the children, the moss, the puddles, and the sapling all bore traces of care, empathy, and subtle guidance, evidence that influence, patience, and attention extended far beyond immediate perception. And as sleep embraced him, he carried the gentle certainty that his journey, layered, patient, and intertwined with life, was unfolding as it should, guiding him toward deeper awareness, connection, and the courage to honor both the seen and unseen currents of the world around him. And somewhere, he's still out there, napping in the sun. The night had a softness to it that made the edges of the world blur. The stars peeking gently through the haze of distant clouds, casting faint speckles of light across the ceiling. Rick lay quietly, the memory of the lot lingering in his mind, the moss, the puddles, and the sapling all etched in the corners of his awareness. It was a feeling that refused to be fully captured. Part wonder, part nostalgia, part quiet gratitude, and acknowledgement that the echoes of presence and care did not simply vanish, but folded themselves into memory like a delicate secret. Morning arrived slowly, the kind that felt unhurried, like the world itself was taking a deep, contemplative breath. Rick moved through the lot, noticing subtle changes he might have overlooked before, the way the sunlight brushed the moss at a new angle, the faint shimmer of a puddle that had captured reflections of days past, the sapling's leaves stretching more confidently toward the sky. There was a gentle rhythm to all of it, a pulse of continuity, as if the lot had absorbed every moment of attention, every subtle gesture, and was now breathing in harmony with the quiet resonance of the lives it cradled. Elliot appeared soon after, moving with that deliberate patience that had become their shared practice. Together they traced the familiar paths, observing the children who began to arrive gradually, each step carrying a weight of accumulated attentiveness. Today, Rick noticed something new. The children seemed to sense not just the space, but the history within it, the quiet accumulation of care that shaped the lot and their interactions with one another. They moved with gentleness, pausing thoughtfully, exchanging glances that carried an understanding beyond words, responding to the subtle choreography of presence, memory, and empathy that had woven itself through their shared experiences. By Mid-morning, Rick observed the children settling into a pattern that felt almost ritualistic, yet entirely natural. Small gestures previously guided or modeled now flowed instinctively. A child lifted a leaf, noticing the play of light beneath it. Another traced ripples in a puddle, pausing as if to acknowledge an echo from yesterday. Every movement reflected a silent continuity, a resonance that could not be taught but had been absorbed, internalized, and reflected back in ways both gentle and profound. Rick felt a quiet awe at the depth of this unseen interconnection, realizing that influence, patience, and presence had created a space in which subtle heroism could flourish. Elliot, sketching quietly, whispered, "It's like the lot itself remembers them. And us." Rick nodded, feeling the truth of it in the faint breeze that stirred the moss, the sway of the sapling, and the mirrored glimmers in the puddles. Presence had become a language, memory a guide, and influence a quiet companion that extended far beyond immediate perception. The lot had become a sanctuary not merely of physical space, but of emotional resonance, layered in attention, care, and subtle understanding. As the afternoon deepened, Rick wandered among the children, observing how their movements reflected patience, empathy, and attentiveness. Disputes resolved themselves with quiet negotiation, gestures mirrored each other with soft precision, and every interaction seemed to carry the weight of prior awareness. Even the environment participated, the moss yielding just enough, puddles, reflecting the light and shadows in delicate balance, the sapling arching gently, as if in acknowledgement of the rhythm unfolding around it. Rick felt a profound reverence for the quiet currents of care and attention that guided every movement, shaping experience and understanding without the need for instruction or insistence. By evening, the children had dispersed once more, leaving. Faint traces of curiosity, wonder, and presence scattered like whispers across the lot. Rick and Elliot sat beneath the stone wall, the fading sun casting a muted golden glow. Rick reflected on the subtle legacy of attentiveness, realizing that influence, patience, and empathy formed a continuous, enduring network that extended beyond immediate recognition, shaping hearts and the environment in ways almost invisible, yet deeply felt. That night, as stars peered softly through the curtains, Rick lay quietly, feeling a gentle certainty. Presence, patience, and attentiveness, layered, cumulative, enduring, were quietly guiding him toward understanding, connection, and the courage to honor both seen and unseen currents. And as sleep drew him near, he felt a calm, abiding peace, knowing that the echoes of care and quiet heroism would ripple endlessly through the lives and spaces they touched. The dawn arrived with a quiet clarity, the kind that made the edges of the world shimmer as if it were freshly remembered. Rick walked slowly through the lot, noticing how the sunlight now lingered longer on the moss, casting delicate shadows that seemed to curve and bend around invisible threads of memory. The sapling, taller now, leaned subtly toward the open sky, as if acknowledging every quiet gesture that had nurtured it. Rick felt a soft smile touch him, the recognition that patience, attention, and care had layered themselves into every inch of this space, making it more than a lot, more than a place. It had become a living tapestry of presence. Elliot appeared soon after, his sketchbook tucked under one arm, moving with the deliberate calm that had become their shared rhythm. Together, they traced the familiar paths, observing the faint changes that signaled the ongoing influence of their quiet attentiveness. Children arrived gradually, their steps hesitant yet curious, carrying the echoes of the patterns and gestures they had absorbed over the preceding days. Rick noticed how these gestures no longer needed instruction. The children mirrored the subtle rhythms of patience and empathy, instinctively understanding the invisible choreography that had been cultivated. By mid-morning, Rick observed the quiet magic that had begun to ripple further than before. A child paused beside a puddle, tracing a pattern that reminded Rick of a gesture he himself had made weeks prior. Another knelt near the sapling, adjusting a leaf to watch sunlight dance beneath it, unaware that she was echoing a movement absorbed from another day, another person, yet perfectly in tune with the rhythm of the lot. Rick felt a deep, almost reverent understanding. Influence, patience, and attentiveness did not merely teach, they became a living memory within those who received it, subtly shaping perception and action over time. Elliot, sketching quietly, whispered, "It's as if they've inherited the language of the lot." Rick nodded, recognizing the truth in the words. The lot had become a medium of quiet legacy, a repository of subtle guidance, and a space where presence, empathy, and attentiveness could ripple outward, far beyond immediate observation. Every gesture, every pause, every thoughtful glance contributed to the tapestry of care and understanding that now enveloped the space, the children, and even themselves. As the afternoon deepened, Rick wandered among the children, noting how their movements had grown more confident, yet gentle, deliberate, yet unforced. Moments of playful disagreement resolved themselves with quiet negotiation. Smiles mirrored across pairs of children, and even the moss and puddles seemed to respond, yielding, reflecting, and bending in harmony with the subtle currents of interaction. Rick felt a profound reverence for the unseen threads that connected memory, attentiveness, and influence, understanding that this quiet web of care was not ephemeral but enduring, layered over time, shaping experiences in ways that were invisible, yet deeply real. By evening, the children had drifted away, leaving traces of curiosity, wonder, and gentle influence scattered across the lot. Rick and Elliot sat beneath the low stone wall, watching the sun dip below the horizon, bathing the moss, sapling, and puddles in a muted, golden glow. Rick reflected on the invisible yet undeniable consequences of attentiveness, realizing that influence was never immediate or measured in grand gestures. It lived quietly in the layering of presence, the patient guidance of small actions, and the echo of subtle care. The lot was now a living testament to the enduring poetry of connection, patience, and quiet heroism. That night, as Rick lay beneath the ceiling, the stars glimmering softly through the curtains, he felt a gentle exhale of understanding. Presence, patience, and attentiveness were woven together across time, forming delicate, enduring patterns that shaped both hearts and environment. And as sleep claimed him, he carried the quiet certainty that the layers of care, memory, and influence would continue to ripple, guiding both the world and the hearts within it toward a softer, more attentive rhythm. The morning arrived quietly, as if the world itself were exhaling in gentle rhythm. Rick walked through the lot slowly, each step deliberate, feeling the moss yield beneath his shoes and the sapling stretch upward toward a sky that seemed wider, softer, and more luminous than before. The sunlight fell in muted pools across the puddles, catching reflections of clouds drifting lazily, and Rick paused to watch the subtle distortions ripple across the water. He realized, almost with a sense of wonder, that the lot had become a mirror, not only of the space around it, but of the care, patience, and attentiveness layered into it over time. Elliot joined him soon after, sketchbook in hand, moving with a rhythm that had become second nature to both of them. They walked together, their presence a quiet counterpoint to the subtle life around them. Children arrived gradually, some hesitantly, some with bright curiosity, and Rick noticed the way their gestures mirrored not only the lot's rhythms, but also the memory of all previous days. Gentle glances, soft pauses, careful touches, and deliberate attention. It was as if they had absorbed the essence of presence without needing to name it, carrying the invisible lessons of patience and empathy in their motions. By mid-morning, Rick observed the quiet choreography of interactions taking form. A child knelt beside a puddle, tilting it slightly to watch sunlight play across the reflections. Another adjusted a leaf on the sapling to let a ray of light pass through. Each movement was small, almost imperceptible, yet significant in its accumulation of attentiveness. Rick felt a deep reverence for these subtle expressions, recognizing that influence and care were not measured in words or instruction, but in the quiet shaping of awareness and the gentle resonance that flowed from one moment to the next. Elliot whispered softly as he sketched, "They carry it now, the rhythm of the lot." Rick nodded, understanding fully. The lot had become a living archive of quiet heroism, patience, and reflection. Presence itself had taken form, guiding, nurturing, and influencing in ways that were imperceptible yet profoundly enduring. Every gesture, pause, and subtle motion layered itself into the ongoing story of the space and its inhabitants, shaping memory, perception, and interaction without ever needing recognition. As the afternoon stretched, Rick wandered among the children, noticing how disagreements resolved themselves through careful negotiation, how laughter rippled gently like the reflections in puddles, and how their movements mirrored the rhythms he and Elliot had cultivated over weeks. Even the sapling, the moss, and the puddles seemed to respond, bending, yielding, and reflecting in harmony with the currents of presence and attention that wove through the lot. Rick felt a profound stillness, a reverent understanding that the quiet accumulation of care was the true measure of influence, shaping not only space but the hearts and minds of those who moved within it. By evening, the children had dispersed, leaving traces of curiosity, wonder, and attentiveness scattered across the lot like soft whispers. Rick and Elliot sat beneath the low stone wall, watching the sun dip gently into a horizon that seemed calmer, softer, and somehow more alive. Rick reflected on the subtle legacy of patience, empathy, and quiet guidance, realizing that true influence unfolded gradually, invisibly, and beautifully, carrying itself forward across days, hearts, and spaces. The lot was no longer merely a physical place, it was a living testament to the enduring poetry of attentiveness and care, a sanctuary of quiet presence that would ripple outward in ways both seen and unseen. That night, as Rick lay beneath the ceiling, stars peeking softly through the curtains, he felt a slow, gentle exhale of understanding. Presence, patience, and attentiveness were woven delicately through time, layering invisible threads of care and guidance into every corner of experience. And as sleep claimed him, he felt a quiet certainty that these ripples would continue endlessly, shaping hearts and spaces, echoing softly through the world in rhythms of calm, reflection, and gentle wonder. The morning light arrived with a tenderness that made the world feel suspended, each detail softened by a quiet awareness. Rick walked slowly through the lot, feeling the gentle give of moss beneath his feet, listening to the faint trickle of water from a puddle disturbed by a passing breeze. The sapling, now taller and more confident, stretched toward the sky with an almost imperceptible sway, a quiet testament to time, care, and the accumulation of attention. Rick realized with a gentle wonder that influence was not always visible or immediate. It was like sunlight filtering through leaves, shaping growth without ever demanding recognition. Elliot arrived soon after, moving with deliberate calm, sketchbook in hand. Together, they traced the paths that had become more than just routes through a lot. They were channels of subtle memory, of layered attentiveness, and of quiet guidance. The children arrived gradually, each carrying a sense of familiarity, of unspoken understanding. They moved with a deliberate softness, gestures echoing those modelled over weeks, yet carried in a way that felt uniquely their own. The lot had become a living dialogue, a space where presence, patience, and subtle guidance coalesced into something that could be felt but rarely articulated. By mid-morning, Rick noticed the way the children's interactions had evolved. A moment of hesitation resolved into gentle negotiation. A small argument faded under the weight of soft attention and mutual awareness. Every movement reflected a careful rhythm learned from quiet observation, and Rick felt a profound reverence for the invisible network of influence that stretched across time, space, and memory. The puddles shimmered, as if acknowledging their care. The moss bent delicately under each step, and the saplings seemed to nod in gentle approval of the unfolding harmony. Elliot whispered softly as he sketched, "They've absorbed it without needing to be told." Rick nodded, understanding fully. The lot had become a repository of subtle heroism, a sanctuary where the quiet accumulation of attentiveness, empathy, and presence was far more enduring than any grand gesture. Every thoughtful pause, every mirrored action, and every careful movement had layered itself into an ongoing story of influence, patience, and reflection. A story that would persist far beyond their immediate perception. As the afternoon stretched lazily across the sky, Rick moved among the children, observing their interactions as if witnessing a slow, deliberate dance. Laughter rippled like soft echoes, mirrored gestures became almost imperceptible affirmations of attention, and even the environment seemed to participate, the moss, puddles, and sapling bending, yielding, and reflecting in harmony with the quiet currents of presence. Rick felt a gentle awe at the subtle power of cumulative care, realizing that real heroism often went unnoticed, existing only in the quiet shaping of perception, memory, and emotion. By evening, the children had departed, leaving faint traces of curiosity, attentiveness, and gentle wonder scattered across the lot. Rick and Elliot sat beneath the stone wall, watching the sun descend, bathing the moss, sapling, and puddles in muted, golden light. Rick reflected on the enduring consequences of patience and attentiveness, realizing that influence was not measured in immediate impact or recognition, but in the slow, steady accumulation of presence, care, and quiet guidance. The lot had become a living testament to these truths, a sanctuary of reflection and subtle heroism, holding within it the legacy of all who had passed through its quiet rhythm. That night, as Rick lay beneath the ceiling, stars peeking softly through the curtains, he felt a gentle, encompassing exhale. Presence, patience, and attentiveness had woven themselves delicately across time, leaving a quiet imprint on both hearts and spaces. And as sleep claimed him, he felt a calm certainty that these ripples would continue endlessly, guiding the world and the people within it toward a softer, more deliberate, and more profoundly connected rhythm. The morning came with a hush, the teats kind of quiet that felt like the world itself had paused to breathe. Rick stepped into the lot, noticing the soft shimmer of dew on moss and the delicate arc of sunlight across the sapling's leaves. The space had grown quietly alive with history, memory, and gentle influence, each element shaped by the countless small gestures of presence and care that had accumulated over time. It was a place transformed not by grand acts but by patient attentiveness, quiet reflection, and the soft resonance of every thoughtful movement. Elliot appeared beside him, sketchbook in hand, and they walked together along familiar paths. The children arrived gradually, their steps gentle, their movements unhurried, carrying the quiet rhythm of all that had come before. Rick observed how their gestures mirrored not only the lot's subtle patterns, but also the memory of previous days, the soft pauses, the careful attention, the empathy quietly absorbed. There was a continuity here that could not be measured but only felt, a delicate balance of influence, memory, and presence flowing through every action, every glance, every soft-spoken word. By mid-morning, Rick watched the children interact with a sense of quiet awe. Small disagreements resolved themselves with calm negotiation, laughter rippled softly, and even the environment seemed to respond, the moss yielding to careful steps, puddles reflecting light and shadow in gentle harmony, and the sapling swaying, slightly, as if acknowledging the unfolding rhythm. Rick realized that influence was not immediate. It was layered, cumulative, and enduring, woven into moments so subtle that one could almost overlook their significance. Yet these moments carried weight, shaping perception, fostering empathy, and creating a quiet legacy that extended far beyond what could be seen. Elliot whispered, "It feels like the lot itself remembers them." Rick nodded, understanding fully. Memory, attentiveness, and presence had formed a network of quiet heroism, a living testament to the accumulation of care. Every mirrored action, every pause, every gentle interaction had built a foundation of subtle influence that would persist, carrying forward lessons of empathy, patience, and attentiveness. The lot had become more than a space. It was a sanctuary of quiet reflection, holding within it the invisible threads that connected hearts and memories across time. As the afternoon unfolded, Rick moved among the children, observing their natural grace, the way gestures flowed from observation into instinct, the way presence had been absorbed and transformed into personal understanding. Even the environment seemed to participate. The puddles shimmered, the moss bent delicately, and the sapling arched in quiet acknowledgement. Rick felt a profound stillness, a reverent understanding that the true measure of influence lay not in recognition or applause, but in the patient accumulation of attentiveness and care, shaping experiences and memories in ways both unseen and enduring. By evening, the children had drifted away, leaving behind traces of curiosity, attentiveness, and gentle wonder scattered across the lot. Rick and Elliot sat beneath the stone wall, the fading sun casting a warm, golden glow over moss, puddles, and sapling alike. Rick reflected on the quiet legacy of presence and patience, realizing that real impact is often invisible, residing in subtle gestures and enduring rhythms of care that ripple far beyond immediate perception. The lot had become a living testament to these truths, a sanctuary of reflection and quiet heroism, carrying the whispers of every heart and every step taken within it. That night, as Rick lay beneath the ceiling, stars peeking softly through the curtains, he felt a slow, encompassing exhale. Presence, patience, and attentiveness had woven themselves through time, leaving a delicate imprint on hearts, memories, and the spaces they inhabited. And as sleep embraced him, he felt the quiet certainty that these ripples would continue, guiding both the world and those within it towards softer, more deliberate, and profoundly connected rhythms. And with that, he stretched into the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. See, end.